Great, we are recording. Thank you so much for being here, Jimmy Wells, founder of Wikipedia, and my friend now for 15 years, which is its own kind of privilege. We will do a super salon, so this is recorded, otherwise staying close to normal inter-interact salons. And we will talk about the present and future of facts, and whether the thing we call a fact has gone through some, epistemological changes in the past decade, and if so, are those changes good or not? A little background, maybe to our friendship, Jimmy. We first met in 2006 in Budapest at Central European University, when you guys were talking about IP and Creative Commons with Larry Lessig. And the next time we met, I think it was 2015 in Index on Censorship, at an Index on Censorship event in London. And I think these two, parties say a lot about how the internet changed in that decade, right? And what was in our focus and what was in Wikipedia's focus. So we will talk a little bit about IP and the origin of facts, right, or ideas, but also the politics and the dangers of being a platform where fact might fight another fact. I think it's recently been called the brain behind the last platform for a shared reality. So there's some responsibility to that, I'm sure. We have members. So Wikipedia just celebrated your 20th anniversary. Congratulations. So we have people in our community in Inter-Interact who probably are the same age. So I really would like to go back and talk a little bit about your brainchild without taking it for granted. We take you for granted, right? We take you for almost a common good. So let's talk a little bit about it as a creation and how did it come to be? Would you like to kind of tell us the origin story?
Sure, yeah. I mean, I'll just take a few minutes and kind of go through the story arc, I suppose. So the original concept, a free encyclopedia for everyone in their own language, written by volunteers, I actually had that concept 2 years before Wikipedia, approximately 2 years, and created a project called Newpedia, which was an effort to create a free encyclopedia. But I didn't really know about online communities. I didn't know, there was a lot I didn't know. And so what we did, we organized a very academic, very top-down, very traditional structure. People had to, this tells you how long ago it was, people had to fax in their CV to show that they were qualified to write something.
Guys, a fax machine is this machine that spits out paper
through the phone lines, and after a couple of years of doing that, progress was extremely slow, and I was getting frustrated. And so I thought, well, I'll write an article myself. So that I can go through the process so I can understand why it's so slow. And I had been a PhD student in finance. I had published a paper on option pricing theory, so very arcane mathematical stuff. And Robert Merton had won the Nobel Prize in economics for his work on option pricing theory just around that time. And I thought, oh, well, I've worked through all of his academic work. He was a real giant in that field at that time. And I know his work very, very well, and I'll just write a short biography of Merton. And I sat down to write it, and I knew that they were going to take my draft and send it to the most prestigious finance professors they could find to critique it and give feedback like an academic paper. And it just wasn't fun. It felt like being back in grad school, but with no real reward at the end, like a PhD or something. So I realized then, I'm like, this isn't really going to work. This isn't fun. Like, I'm finding myself super stressed even to write a short biography of this person whose work I know very well. I could, And so that was when, it became obvious that we needed to make a pivot. Nobody used that term back then. That's a Silicon Valley term nowadays. But, something had to change. Clearly, something huge had to change. I actually... My daughter was born. This is the personal element of the story. She was born December 26th of 2000. And then just so you know, Wikipedia was founded January 15th of 2001. And what happened was when she was born, I was thinking of giving up the project. Like it just wasn't working. It was quite expensive. I had several people working on it. And when she was born, she had meconium aspiration syndrome, which is like it's a syndrome that happens to babies sometimes when they're born. And she was in intensive care in the hospital. I was there for a long time, but then eventually I had to come home to sleep and came home and got on the internet and tried to understand more. And I realized how badly the internet sucked. You just couldn't find clear information. I just wanted the facts. And that was really, for me, it was like quite an emotional thing that I said, look, I can't just give up on this. Like this idea of an encyclopedia where you could look things like this up is really important to people. And so, but I decided also like life's too short. I can't just keep sort of doing it the same old way, but rather than giving up. So that was when on January 15th, we made the complete and radical shift, which Jeremy Rosenfeld, one of my staff, had shown me a wiki a few weeks sort of before Christmas, saying, oh, there's this other way maybe we could use a wiki to do this. And I was like, well, yeah, let's just do that. Like this whole other system isn't working. We just came in and blew everything up and just said, let's just do it. But we had all these academics who had signed up for Nupedia, and they were all very serious and academic. And I thought, well, they might hate this idea. So we'll just start it under a different name. We won't call it Nupedia, we'll just call it Wikipedia. It'll be a side project, and we'll just show it to them and say, oh, it's just a side project. Maybe it's a testing ground where we may create some content that will make its way eventually into Nupedia. But very quickly, within 2 weeks, we had as much work done as in 2 years. I mean, it was really phenomenal. I mean, as much work done means, I think, about 24 short articles, So it really took off. And, we had this, at that time in the community, we had about 5,000 people on the mailing lists. We had a couple hundred people who were active on the mailing list, 5,000 people had signed up on the website. There were a couple hundred people active on the mailing list in different languages, discussing what does it mean to have an encyclopedia? How would we do this? And discussing all kinds of technical ideas and things like that. We weren't getting anywhere, but we were having, good conversations. And suddenly those people were free to jump in and start writing things. And, you could, from the very early days, you could be the first person to write, Paris is a city in France and hit save. And okay, it's not very good. It's not much of an encyclopedia, but there you go. You can get started. And so, as we carried on, obviously a lot of interesting questions came up very quickly. So now bringing this around just from the founding story to the questions of tonight around facts, knowledge, epistemology, truth. A lot of questions came up very early on that were clearly of great importance, and we had to answer them. And I think we made some really good choices, which only really became obviously good, I would say, in recent years. One proposal I remember was there was a guy who proposed that, gee, it's really hard to write a single entry on everything because there's so many different views and so on. Maybe we should have not just one entry on each topic, but have competing entries and have, you could have, say, these days we might say, why don't we have the Republican view of January 6th and the Democratic view of January 6th, and maybe we'll have you can think of a million examples like this where you would just have completely diverging narratives. And I considered that, and I said, you know what? No, I don't think that's the right answer. I think the right answer is for us to get together as human beings, really work hard to chew on these things, try to come to some kind of a consensus, even though in many cases, that consensus really just consists of what I call going meta. So you just step back one level. So, you're not going to solve in Wikipedia the question of, pick any question of our times, but let's just pick a classic kind of hot button example would be a question about abortion. So, the Catholic Church view of abortion versus Planned Parenthood view of abortion. These are very divergent. You're never going to come to a complete consensus on everything. But what you can come to a consensus on, as long as you've got thoughtful, kind people, is to present that argument, to present what the debate is and what different people believe, and you can present it in an accurate and fair fashion. So if you imagine the kind and thoughtful Catholic priest will understand that Wikipedia isn't going to say, abortion is a sin, but it can say the Catholic Church position on abortion is thus and such, and critics have responded so and so and so on. And you know the style and you know the format of Wikipedia, which I believe is exactly what you really want from an encyclopedia. You don't want to be spoon-fed one side of a story. You want to actually hear all of the reasonable sides. You want to sort of understand the issue, and then you've got more information so that you can make a judgment yourself. Now I've slipped in there's a little subtle rhetorical trick here, which is all the reasonable or major or important viewpoints. And that's actually quite important and does also generate sort of a large body of things to talk about and discuss. So I always say, if you think about neutrality at Wikipedia, if you read the Wikipedia entry on the moon, it doesn't say, some say the moon is made of rocks and some say cheese, right? Like that's not neutrality. Like that's just nonsense, right? At the same time, you can say there are contentious issues. There are historical incidents that are not fully settled. There are perfectly respectable or varying degrees of respectable issues around this, and you have to address those in a fair and thoughtful manner. And I think this is, this is something that we see this a lot. So I years and years ago, many years before Wikipedia, I became really fascinated with the debate between creationists and evolutionists. Not because it's, in my view, any kind of a reasonable debate. The evidence is clear. But what I found interesting about it was a certain kind of rhetorical trick that the creationists would use, which is they would find some legitimate debate between different parts of the scientific community. So Darwinists versus neo-Darwinists. And then they would cherry pick quotes to say, even scientists don't agree with Darwin. And it's like, hold on, like that's really not exactly what's going on. Like this is a scientific debate about specific details. This isn't a rejection wholesale and sort of now you can just play it wild. So one more example, and then I'll stop dominating here and sort of we can have a conversation. But at one point, someone noticed that in Wikipedia about the Mormon Church, the Church of Latter-day Saints in the U.S., which is a pretty reasonably sized sort of religion, that all of the entries around that were very uncritical. Like they were just sort of stating the Mormon stories from a Mormon point of view, which are stories that are not, it's sort of, they're not aligned exactly with Christianity or mainstream Christianity and so on and so forth. And this person's fix for it was actually not a very good fix, but it was a good start at a fix. He just went to every single one of those entries and changed sentences to say things like, in the Mormon religion, comma, and then go on and on, as opposed to just sort of stating, so-and-so was a prophet. You say, well, in the Mormon religion, so-and-so's a prophet. Actually, I think Mormon isn't the preferred term by that group, but anyway. And so that was like a very basic kind of start, but it's a very Wikipedian thing to do, to say, ooh, actually, this is a contentious statement. We have to go meta. We have to step back a level. And then we begin to sort of kind of reach some consensus about presenting it. So anyway, I'll pause there.
Thank you so much. It's so interesting. I read about how, I didn't know that before preparing for this salon, that you had this idea for basically adversarial commentary, almost like Talmud, right? There is a statement and then somebody comes and adds their own point of view to it. And that there was a stage in the development of the product where that seemed the way to go. And when we first collaborated on Wiki Tribune, when you held this kind of 2-day hackathon in London, I was working on a startup that was trying to do something similar. And it's really interesting how the first idea you have is always like, oh, let's bring in the two partners and let's debate it out, right? And then you realize that that's not necessarily a good thing, because there will be elements at play that have nothing to do with fact, will have nothing to do with the actual, objective truth. And what you need is a platform for consensus and consensus building. And that was the same for my startup and how we evolved into Intra-Intellect, right? When you say we can come together from multiple points of view and, have a conversation and find that common ground together. And so the consensus, becoming the focus is super important, and leading to, I think, your main area of expertise, which is the governance question. And here immediately you see that you cannot have, widely accepted fact without incredibly good governance around it. And we have,
absolutely. I mean, one of the things that we talk about a lot is behavior. So behavior in the community is a really important aspect of things. And one of the sort of things that we really always discourage people from is a battleground mentality. And actually, from outside Wikipedia, a lot of people assume that's what it's all about. You come into Wikipedia, the two sides do battle, and in the end, somehow you get to consensus. No, you just get a flame war. It's not helpful at all. Like, you just get people screaming at each other. What you really need is people to come in and say, okay, look, you're a human being, I'm a human being. Probably we're both basically decent people. That does apply, by the way, to, I always say, out of every 1,000 people, there's probably 10 who are super annoying, but probably one or fewer who are actually malicious. And so you gotta think about all those people. But the truth is 990 out of the 1,000, I'm making these numbers up, of course, most people are basically nice. I mean, we know this in our day-to-day life. You meet all kinds of people, that people are basically nice, and they're not crazed ideologues who are trying to ram their ideas down other people's throats. They're just like people going through life trying to understand the world. And yeah, we have differences and people have strongly held beliefs, but in general, we can see through that and say, okay, actually, this is a person. And so let's have a conversation, a dialogue. And if we do it well, we may not end up agreeing at the end of the day, but we will end up growing and understanding things a little bit better. And that's very powerful. And that having that set of values in the community is really, I think, crucial for the long-term health of Wikipedia. I mean, if we descend into warring factions, it's just not very useful. It isn't very helpful. And I mean, I think this is for me, one of the reasons I'm such a big supporter of Inter-Intellect is it's exactly like, okay, let's just get some interesting people together and have conversations where fundamentally we're not here to yell at each other. Not everyone's going to agree on certain topics, right? But actually, if you want to see people yelling at each other, I mean, just, I don't know, turn on the television. There's plenty of that. It's not very helpful. Oh, go on Twitter, sort of a platform designed for screaming at each other. And instead say, you know what, actually, it's not that interesting. It's much more interesting to really dig in and chew on things with people, whether I agree with them or not. So anyway, the point is, within Wikipedia, that is, I would say, the most fundamental set of values. And so sometimes it's not hard if you look around, or if you're me and it gets thrown in your face all the time to say, oh yeah, Wikipedia is left-wing, or Wikipedia is full of right-wing Zionists, or whatever you want to call it, right? And in fact, it's like, well, it's a diverse community, not as diverse as we would like in certain ways. That's another topic we could talk about. But in general, it's quite hard to characterize in that fashion. It's thoughtful people. Some of them will be more liberal, some of them will be more conservative, some of them will be more religious, some less religious, and so on and so forth. And there probably are certain majorities in the community that are different from the general public, and so on and so forth, as would be natural with a bunch of geeks. But in general, I think it's just too simplistic to assume that we're ideological in any simple way, other than the deeper ideology that I'm talking about, which is the ideology that says, actually an important moral value is thinking. Just really thinking about ideas is an ethical obligation. And that is something that I do think is important.
And conversation as a democratic value, right? And thinking that it's a democratic value is not, it's not inherently taking sides politically. It's taking the side of good politics, right?
Sure.
John raised his hand, but can I have just one kind of closing question here to the intro part, and then I'm going to pass the mic on to Texas. Was there ever a moment, and I know you're currently in a kind of semi-friendly battle with them at the moment, and obviously Wikipedia came to be because of your frustration of there not being good enough facts on the internet. And when I was in high school, there was Yahoo and Alta Vista. And if anybody here remembers Alta Vista, you don't necessarily want to go to the restaurant that Alta Vista recommends to you, if there is even one. Was there any moment
when using Alta Vista? I remember the first time I used Google, I'm like, finally the internet works.
Yeah,
it was that big a dramatic difference.
Yeah, dramatic and traumatic. Was there a moment when you guys could have become Google?
Oh, I don't know. I mean, it's an interesting question, because like Wikipedia was always an idea. It was a project. It was a thing that needed doing. And in the early days, I wasn't thinking of it as a business or not a business. Like that just wasn't even a factor to think about. It was just like, this is a thing that should exist. So let's just start working on it. And in the early days, we thought, maybe ads could be a business model, but I was like, that doesn't seem right for this. It's not aesthetically what I want. Maybe we could charge people, but no, it's really ideologically quite, open source, freely licensed and all of that. I just thought that's not the vision. And in fact, for the volunteers, the idea that you're working on something that people have to pay to use doesn't sound very appealing. Whereas something that's free, and freely distributed and is meaningful, like, all those things. So I don't know, but I mean, there was never, it wasn't really ever a question. I mean, when that might have been a question was when Wikipedia really started to grow, which was in those first couple of years. We were doubling in traffic every 3 months, and so on. That was also the depths of the .com crash. So there was no real way to raise money. There was no obvious business model. So it just made sense. Just let's put it in a nonprofit, and let's see if people will donate money to buy more servers, because we badly need more servers. And in fact, that first fundraiser, I had hoped to raise $20,000 in 1 month, but we raised $30,000 in about 2 weeks. So it was a real success. So that really put us, on the right track, and it's been the same ever since.
I went to university in 2002. That's when I studied my bachelor's, and I remember the first year, the professor had no idea that Wikipedia existed, so you could just print out entire Wikipedia pages. I mean, I didn't, of course, but you could have theoretically done that. And my entire year at university got away doing this with. I remember the title of the essay was "Religion in Hamlet." And it's as exciting as it sounds. And everybody was just printing it out until one dummy forgot to remove the actual link from under the bottom of the page, and then everybody got in trouble. So that was, I think teachers found out the hard way about Wikipedia.
When I talk to, especially to young students nowadays, I always say, don't just copy things from Wikipedia, because the truth is your teachers read Wikipedia as well. So they're definitely going to notice it. Everyone's reading.
Or they write it. I mean, if I wanted to catch my own students, I would go and edit the Religion in Hamlet and add something about Teletubbies. And then just whenever that comes back to me, I would know that this person did not read it. Thank you so much. I'm going to go to John, and then John, Carl, Jason, Tom. I think that was the order.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Anna. Hi, Jimmy. We're calling in from Texas. We're a group of folks that actually met on Twitter and are here hanging out at Creator Cabins.
Cool.
And we've been talking a lot about crypto this week. And you were mentioning governance structures and this sort of decentralized approach to overcoming collective action problems. And we've been very curious and thinking a lot about that in the context of how creators can come together and make things. If you had advice for the kind of the Web3, about how to take maybe the top 3 principles of what made Wikipedia work that could be applied to a decentralized approach to bringing people together to solve problems for crypto. what advice would you have?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really interesting one, and it's a tough one because, I mean, we can talk about, there are different kinds of problems that may require different kinds of solutions. So that's just a general fact about the world, really. And when I think about the problems around, certain problems in crypto, for example, things like, well, I think we could all agree, one of the biggest problems right now is that proof of work is incredibly energy intensive, and that's a problem, okay? But it's a problem that is there for a reason, which is you've got to solve this sort of decentralized coordination issue, and then there's proof of work, proof of space, other possibilities. But the thing is it's very different from something like Wikipedia, where you just go, well, just trust people, they'll probably do all right, there'll be some annoying people who, because in the context of financial transaction, of course, there'll be a few annoying people who steal thousands of dollars from their friends. Okay, that's not actually the right answer. It's not the same thing as there'll be a few annoying people who vandalize Wikipedia entries and we have to ban them. So there's a lot at stake, and there's a lot of incentives for bad actors to act badly. On the other hand, what you might be asking, though, is really more, if we think about some of the sort of open source projects behind crypto, I think there's a lot of learnings there around, ideas of rough consensus and running code, of being thoughtful and open and inclusive, and creating values, structures, but also values within these communities to say, actually, we need to thoughtfully listen and reflect. And we've seen, a lot of the structures are implicitly that, but they're implicitly that because there's some sort of a benevolent dictator. But always when you look at the benevolent dictators, the ones who are successful are the ones who actually listen to people and don't just sort of try and ram their own ideas down people's throats. They actually try to be, find the consensus within their communities to do things a different way, or the old way, and things like that. So yeah, there's a million things to think about, and a million different issues. So don't know if that's helpful at all.
Actually, Balaji is here. I don't know if Balaji, you want to jump in and reflect on the crypto angle here. It's very, very late there, so maybe not.
I can talk another element.
Not yet.
You're up?
Let me.
Okay.
Why don't I wait? I'll wait till.
Thank you so much.
Sure. I was just going to say the other thing is that it's died down a lot now, but in the early days of the crypto boom, I had all these people coming to me with their ideas for sort of Wikipedia on the blockchain kind of concepts. And a lot of the ideas, I would say most of them, that people come to first, if you start reflecting on the problem, people don't understand very well what the problems are inside Wikipedia, and so they don't understand why their solution won't work. So, things like, people say, oh, well, you could, I don't know, incentivize the creators, and then people could earn coins depending on if other people agree with them, blah, 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 blah. And most of those really boil down to the truth should go to the highest bidder, which clearly is the wrong answer for Wikipedia. It's like, yeah, okay, I'm sure that Exxon would like to have a slightly different story for Exxon Valdez oil spill, and they probably have more money and care more about it than anyone else. Or that's an old, Volkswagen's recent scandal about their emissions testing and so on. So you just don't want that. Like, that's literally a very bad idea. And most of the ideas around rewarding volunteers based on random crypto people paying them are susceptible to that kind of gaming and that kind of problem. That doesn't mean that blockchain or cryptocurrencies are always bad. It's just like, we could do that with real money. We could set up a system where when you have an account, you can get paid and people can send you money through Wikipedia. But it would be a bad idea. So anyway, that's just a lot of the governance problems that we have are kind of orthogonal. Like, they don't map very well to the kinds of problems that financial systems are designed to deal with.
And I mean, you guys run on donations, right? And I
Yeah.
can imagine that when you look at the subscription model, when you look at the advertising model, especially, of course, for business, for just because of sheer business interests, different forms of catering would arise, right? If
Sure.
you run a magazine and you run on subscribers, I mean, this is what we're seeing in the American media these days. Suddenly you start producing a specific kind of audience to cater to a specific kind of specific type of articles for a specific type of audience. I imagine that donations are the best of the not so good solutions in this sense. That
I mean, what I think really works about it. So let's talk about those two business models. So the advertising only business model, I think, has been really devastating for journalism. It's devastating not just directly for journalism, but also the ecosystem journalism lives in, so the social networks, simply because what you optimize for in that environment is clicks, time on site, addiction. So we see all these technologies like TikTok and Twitter that are very addictive. They're about keeping you on the site longer, which isn't necessarily about finding harmony in your life. It's about keeping you agitated. So, you keep coming back and so on. And for a lot of news organizations who are faced sort of with that environment, the only way to survive is to run inflammatory clickbait headlines, sort of fluffy content, cheap, whatever. And it's just not been very healthy. So that model has huge problems, which you can clearly see as well, say, for Wikipedia. So like, imagine if Wikipedia had an advertising business model, because sometimes people say that, oh, why are you asking for money? Why don't you just put an ad on every page and you'd make so much money, it'd be crazy. Well, suddenly I think even, like I'm a board member, but the Wikimedia Foundation is an organization. And I think organizations inherently, the DNA of every organization, for-profit, non-profit, I don't care, follows the money. People, they want resources, they want to have their job be safe, and they want to make more money and lots of good things, and that's all fine. But if we had advertising as our business model, suddenly the organization would start to care more about what well-to-do Californians are interested in than thinking about Wikipedia's growth in the developing world. Like, that just is a fact. I mean, you take a company like Google, for example, who I will praise. Google has always had a very strong ethos around supporting as many languages as possible and being really global. And that's a great thing about Google. But frankly, even for Google, it's not their core mission, clearly. Like, they do it because they believe in it. They see long-term value in it, but it's not their core mission by any means. And so that's an issue. Also, we don't care. Like, if you want to read about Victorian poetry, I mean, honestly, there's nothing to sell you. When you're reading Victorian poetry, you're not going to buy any. I mean, maybe we could sell you some poetry books, but it's not very lucrative. So suddenly we would have an incentive to say, oh, let's move people to, we've got a huge ad campaign coming in from, I don't know, Grand Theft Auto or the Super Bowl or whatever, right? Huge ad campaigns come in. Let's start pushing people on the site. Let's try to get them to the more high value topics because clearly that's just nonsense. That's not what we want Wikipedia to be. So nobody wants that. Then the other one you mentioned, which is paid models, right? Paid models are good. I like paid models. And in particular, the potential problem you mentioned is not a problem in general, I think. Like, if somebody realizes, gee, well, I always say I like boats. I love boats. And so I read boat magazines. And I can tell you one thing about boat magazines. Go and buy 6 or 7 different boat magazines. Just go to a newsstand, buy 6 or 7 different boat magazines. You will never, ever, ever read a negative review of a boat. Part of that is because they love boats, right? Their readers love boats, and their advertisers love boats and love having nice things written about boats. So those are not hard-hitting critical publications, but it's okay. Like, it's fine. It's a boat magazine. It's not, you don't expect it. I mean, clearly if something's really shoddy, they would occasionally, you would hope. I mean, I've never seen it, but there they just choose not to write about those boats. They just ignore them because they're bad. So, and that's fine. And if we think about a publication, I mean, I'll give an example. So the Washington Post, which I really like, and I really thought during the Trump administration, there were times they were doing absolutely fantastic, solid, good journalism. And I love that. But sometimes I would read an article from the Washington Post and I would say, this is just a rant. It's a drooling rant against Donald Trump, which I agree with completely, by the way. I've enjoyed this rant, but I actually don't, you know, when I step back as a Wikipedian, I'm like, this isn't really great journalism. This is just satisfying their subscribers, people like me who hate Donald Trump. And so is that a problem? I mean, it's not the worst problem, but it's something to be aware of.
I'm suddenly reminded of the fact that you guys actually kept the two kind of parties shouting at each other in some sense on Wikipedia. The first thing I always look at when I read about a thinker or a book is I go drop down to criticism. If there's no criticism, it's bad. Then this is a mediocre, lukewarm idea that nobody cared about, right? If nobody took the time to create a criticism entry on Wikipedia for something or subsection, that's, this is not a major
That's
thinker.
a really interesting one, because there is a school of thought which I am 60 to 70% a supporter of, whatever that, I made up a number, that for Wikipedia entries, a criticism section is often a bit lazy. That it's just like, rather than integrate sort of the story and the flow completely correctly, it's just like, oh, here's something bad, just shove it in criticism. And sometimes they just become like magnets for people to come and like, oh, I really don't like this person, so I'm just going to stick in more criticism. So we kind of view it, not everybody, obviously they still exist, so it's not something we have been against completely. But yeah, there are definitely cases where like when we think about bias problems in Wikipedia, it's normally not, in my opinion, it isn't around like the controversial issues of our time, because there you will get thoughtful people interested in the issue who really are working to try to keep it neutral. Where we have problems would be, I would say, if you go and read about obscure Japanese anime in English, it's very positive, because literally no one cares about obscure Japanese anime except for fans. So, it's just like, like, what are they going to say? There's nothing negative to say because no one cares except the people who love it. So
I remember these stories about the person who was obsessed with Kate Middleton's wedding dress when the royal wedding happened. And they were just like, that was their life goal, to create an entry and every little stitch of lace should be described in detail.
That,
so yeah.
That's an interesting story. So that
Nerds around the world.
On the day
was unsure.
Of the royal wedding, someone created that article. And the interesting thing is that someone nominated for deletion, saying, this is stupid, it's just a dress, right? And I weighed in, I rarely weigh in on content issues, but I weighed in and I said, hold on a second. Like, first of all, it's already got like 80 good references. Second, one thing we know, fashion is a huge industry. We know that every sort of royal wedding dress has a huge impact on fashion. This dress definitely did. This has as much cultural impact. And my example, to sort of make my point, I said, look, I just checked. We have entries on over 100 different Linux distributions, many of which have never, 10 people have ever downloaded and used, and nobody complains about those because we're a bunch of geeks and they seem important to us. And so it's like, just because I don't care about it doesn't mean it's not an important thing. And I think that's a really interesting case. And I used to give that example a lot as an example of how I think gender diversity is important in Wikipedia. But then somebody pushed back on me saying, that's actually a sexist example. You're just saying women care about dresses. And I'm like, not really fair to what I'm trying to say, but I'll change my example then. Like, I don't want you to hear that. Oh, we need more women so we can have more articles about dresses. No, that is not what my point at all. It's just like, if you've got a bunch of geeky boys, they're probably not going to be that interested in topics they're not interested in, and that's just a fact. So
I love this sentence, that just because it's not important to me, it doesn't mean that it's not important, right?
Yes, definitely.
That's kind of a guiding principle.
I mean, that is a value that is a value in our community. People do get that, but it's also it's a very human tendency to just there are things I'm literally not interested in, And so I'm not going to go and help with those areas because I don't care. I don't know anything about it. I mean, maybe it's Japanese anime. But I should refrain from barging in there saying, this is stupid. It's a bunch of comic books. You know, I guess anime is not comic books, that's manga, but anyway.
So it's like a good version of pluralism. And we will talk a little bit more about governance and of course, social media, right? Because we sometimes always arrive at social media when we're talking about shared reality formation and fact checking. Your project Wikitribune also evolved a very strong social media element across the years. But I'm going to start taking a few questions, and we go to Carl fast. Thank you for your patience, and thank you for answering the questions, Jimmy.
Thank you, Anna. Hello, Jimmy, and hello to the salon. I'll try and make my question brief as there's many others waiting. First of all, I just really appreciate Wikipedia as a shining example of effective collaboration online. And I'm sure that must have come about through an effective balance of some top-down guideline setting, culture formation, maybe some amount of policing and content vetting. But also what I'm curious about is how much leeway did you feel you could give to the community to really build the bottom-up encyclopedia they wanted to build without it getting out of control? Because so much of what the internet's becoming now with open source software, cryptocurrency and things like that does rely on effective collaboration. And I'm curious what the secret recipe was here and how it maybe surprised you over time.
Yeah, well, I mean, so I would say that certain elements, so some of the really core values, those were set from the beginning. So one of the sort of neutrality, we call it NPOV, neutral point of view. Very early on, I said NPOV is non-negotiable. And what I meant by that is we're not going to have an argument about whether we should become the Catholic encyclopedia or the you know, pro-conservative, pro-liberal, whatever encyclopedia. That's just not a thing we're going to have a conversation about because that's just not what I want to build. And that was never a problem because it turns out neutrality is a great technique for getting people together. So for all the reasons I've been talking about. And then, you know, other things like, you know, some of our values around civility, no personal attacks. That was another rule that I just set down like a lightning bolt from the beginning. Just saying, you know, that's boring. Like, you know, this is pre-Twitter, of course, and pre a lot of places that do encourage or allow personal attacks. But I grew up in the era of Usenet, which if you are old enough to remember that was a cesspool of people screaming at each other. And, you know, I just said, that's just boring. Like, it's not that interesting. And so the idea that, you know, the way to get to truth is by attacking other people. First of all, if you know, it's like, it's an ad hominem. It's not even a logical approach. It's just, that's not a path to the truth. And so we had that rule from the beginning, and that, you know, clearly just saying no personal attacks. Okay, but then what, right? That's fine. But what really has to be developed and I'd say adjudicated and culture built around customs and traditions and values is okay, but we are human beings, so we're messy, sloppy, we get mad at each other. So what counts as a personal attack? What happens if there is a personal attack? It's just like, you know, if we're in a heated discussion and I just go, you know, like, Carl, honestly, you're not even taking this seriously. You're an idiot, right? Okay, that's a personal attack, but it's pretty mild. And then I apologize the next day and I go, I don't know, I was really upset, you know, like, so what, right? People can get through those things. So you don't immediately ban everybody for any small slight. At the same time, there are people who just come in and they're just rampaging around being jerks to others. And it's like, you know, go. And in fact, that's one of the hardest governance issues in the community is always, and this is a perennial sort of problem in Wikipedia, which is, oh, here's a contributor who's doing fantastic work around a topic we all agree is important, a topic that's fairly obscure, and they've written 50 fantastic articles. Meantime, they've been rude and obnoxious to 100 people. What do we do about that? And it's tough because you want to say, actually, we want your content, but we want you to stop being a jerk. And you know, so various ways that people, as a practical matter, the way people deal with that is sometimes there are great people in the community who are just really good at kind of coaching other people like that. And so they kind of go around and protect them and like sort of help them deal with calmer, nicer people. Sometimes they get banned, and that's always a big deal because they've been a good contributor, but they're a jerk. But I mean, my view has been for a long time that and I think the community has moved in this direction. We have a new code of conduct, which came through a long process with the community to say, you know what, actually, we've probably need to move in a direction to say, we need to value the contributions that we aren't receiving because somebody's being a jerk as much as we value the contributions from the jerk. And that's hard to do because you can't see, like the people who got insulted and went away, you never see them and you don't see what they would have produced otherwise. So you have to be conscious about that kind of inclusiveness and say, you know, behaviors that are driving people out of our community who would be otherwise great people, that's, you know, it's not an okay situation. So I think we are improving there, but you know, the thing is, it's a messy, it's human. It's like any group of friends or any sort of public group of people, there's always diversity and therefore people, or they get mad at each other and so on and so forth. You really have to think about how to deal with it.
Thank you, Jimmy. That's a great answer.
Thank you so much. I mean, obviously, we are also running a community and have live events and deal with human behavior a lot. And it's such an important question, you know, whether somebody's just having a bad day or somebody just cannot be trusted in this environment because they will just, you know, ruin the experience for so many other people. And that's always a really, you know, that's always an important question. And I can imagine when your goal is to establish the factual layer of reality, you know, these slights and tensions become extremely important. Because if I'm intimidated by somebody and they come up with a fact, I might not, you know, accept their point of view because I will be like, no, he or she's saying that, I don't care.
Yeah. I mean, we've had people in the community. I remember going back very early years, there was a guy he wrote a lot of stuff about biology, very good, very expert stuff, very tolerant and patient if people had questions. If people challenged something that he wrote, he could, you know, sort of understand and adapt. But boy, get him anywhere near Israel, Palestine, and he was just completely intractable. Like it was impossible. And I think to his credit, he realized after some time that he should just steer clear. Like, you know, it's like me, I would never edit the entry on Donald Trump because I find I boil over so easily because I hate him so much that I can't be a good Wikipedian about that. You know, it's not helpful.
Yeah, we gotta respect our limits. I love that. I'm kind of the same as well. There are topics I wouldn't touch, for instance, hosting a salon about them because I would just talk about my own opinion. Jason, do you wanna take the floor?
Sure. I'm wondering is there anything that social media or the rest of the internet can learn from Wikipedia? Are there lessons that are actually applicable? Somebody actually brought this up on Twitter a couple months ago that sort of like Wikipedia has kind of escaped most of the tech policy conversation around content moderation, and it's escaped a lot of the worst diseases of social media. You know, is there anything that can be learned from that could actually be applied to, you know, some of these other models? Like obviously it's a very different model, but
yeah, that's fantastic. And so I've got two thoughts, two strands of thought on there. So the first is that it's a really hard problem, and Wikipedia ducks most of the really hard problems because we have a purpose, which is to build an encyclopedia. And so Wikipedia is not a wide open free speech forum, never has been, never will be. And so if you come to Wikipedia and you just start ranting your opinion, let's say about Donald Trump, right? So if I go on Wikipedia to the talk page of Donald Trump and start ranting, or I try and edit just to rant, it's not welcome. Like that's not what we're supposed to be doing here. This is not the place for it. So if you love something or you hate something and you come to Wikipedia to just be free and express your opinion, the community is going to go, well, okay, what are you doing? Because we're just writing an encyclopedia here, and do you have a source, and you know, that sort of thing. And that's just because we're not a wide open free speech forum. Whereas on the other hand, social media kind of typically is. You know, there's a box and it's like, what do you think? What's your opinion? You know, say what you think. And that's a hard problem because a great many people have very offensive opinions, and you know, that's just a fact. So it's really hard. And so let's acknowledge that up front. Now, having said that, my other strand of thinking is there is a fundamental difference in the way we have approached content moderation and behavior moderation compared to everyone else. I mean, a few exceptions, but in general, the big platforms, which is that we, and this, by the way, is I think a gift of being born in the dot-com crash. So if you imagine, so you've got a website and you've got people doing stuff on the website. Maybe they're posting videos like on YouTube, or maybe they're starting conversations on Twitter or Facebook. Maybe they're writing an encyclopedia, right? And suddenly you see some problems in the community. Well, one natural response is, oh, we need to hire moderators. We need to hire community managers to make decisions and do this. So all the other social media, I call it it's a feudal model. You know, it's like everybody, all the users are serfs on the Lord's land, and the Lord sets down the rules, and that's it. And so they have followed a model that hasn't scaled very well. So if you've ever had the misfortune to have to report something on Twitter, it's not a very good experience. I mean, all around. I remember once, I mean, whatever, people say all kinds of things, and people usually kind of love Wikipedia and they like me, okay, but obviously there's trolls. And I don't care, that's fine. People can say mean things about me, it's not a big deal. But there was once, you know, someone who was posting that I was a pedophile, and I'm like, you know what, that's not okay. Like, that's completely out of line. I am gonna complain about this. So I hit the button and I complained, and you know, within an hour, I got an email back saying, thank you for your report. We're looking into it. I'm like, oh, this is great. This is working. And then went to bed. Next morning, I get up and there's an email saying, oh, we've reviewed the tweet and we don't see anything that violates our terms of service. And I was like, really? And so I went and I read the terms of service. I'm like, actually, yes, calling someone a pedophile is a violation of the terms of service, clearly. I don't blame whoever wrote that, because frankly, it's a terrible sweatshop job. It's not something that I would ever want to do. And so what did I do? I emailed Jack and I said, Jack Dorsey, I'm like, Jack, come on, like, what is this? And he's like, oh, Jimmy, don't worry, we'll sort it. And I'm like, you're kind of missing my point, Jack, right? I'm Jimmy Wales, I can email Jack Dorsey, right? I know you socially, right? That's fine, but I'm not saying this for myself. I'm like, what about everybody else who doesn't know Jack Dorsey? And what about teenagers being abused, you know, bullied and all this? Like, your system is not working. And so that system where there's a black box of company moderators now assisted by AI, it hasn't scaled very well, and it isn't working very well. And it's completely different from the Wikipedia model. There is no one at the Wikimedia Foundation whose job is to review edits coming in and decide if they're being abusive or not. If you're reporting someone for bad behavior, you're reporting to other community members. It's a shared system. And so the idea is, instead of having that power within the company or within the Wikimedia Foundation, that power is pushed out to the endpoints, to the community. And they make those decisions and they have those debates. And we do have trust and safety people, because there are cases, right, which are actually legal issues or like really kind of scary people making actual threats, where having the organization step in to, you know, whatever needs doing. We have, for example, we've had certain trolls who have come repeatedly to hundreds of different language communities and been trolling and vandalizing. And because of the way we work within, you know, English, French, German, all the languages of the world, that the local systems don't handle that very well. And so we have global bans and things like that. So there's you know, you have to be thoughtful about this, but in general, all that moderation stuff is in the community, the rule setting in the community, the structures for dealing with things, and it scales. And that's the interesting thing. And why does it scale? How does that scale? It scales in the same way like human societies always scale. So you can go from a small village to a small town to a big city to a, you know, and you get different problems, right? There are different problems in small towns than there are in big cities, but still it scales. Like everything, you know, there's more people to deal with, more problems in a big city, and there's different kinds of problems arise and so on. And so that philosophically is the fundamental difference. So if we think about what I would suggest for Twitter and the others is to say, okay, try to think about how you can break away from that top down. We've got this anonymous group of moderators who are making decisions and sadly not doing a very good job of it, not because they're not good at their jobs, but because it's impossible. And how do you devolve that power into the community? And for some of these platforms, that means really a fundamental change of how they do things. And maybe they can't, because maybe they're too locked into a model that doesn't allow that. But, you know, like, okay, let's say you see somebody, you go on Twitter right now, it won't be hard. Just go and look for somebody doing something terrible on Twitter. And now what can you do about it? So you've got three options. You can block that person, which helps you, but doesn't help anybody else. You can report the person, which, as I say, doesn't always work very well. Or you can yell at them, which is, of course, very popular on Twitter, to just go and yell at the person. And I just think that's not good enough. And I think devolving more power into the community, more, you know, finding through some mechanisms, community mechanisms, finding trustworthy people who can say, reduce the reach of somebody who's being abusive, or sever the link between two people to protect someone from an abuser and that sort of thing. And really decentralizing that, to go back to an earlier theme. And it's not easy, right? Because at every step of that way, you've got to think about all the governance issues. So for example, in Wikipedia, we have administrators, they're elected by the community. The job they do as administrators is very transparent. You can see if they've blocked someone, if they've locked an article temporarily, you know, all the admin powers. And they aren't judge, jury, and executioner. The parallel I draw is like their job is like the job of the police, in the sense that the police do have more powers in a certain sense than everyone else. They can arrest you and drag you to jail, but they're responsible, or they should be, frankly. The US has a huge problem with them not being held responsible for carrying out those powers in a specific way, and they can lose their rights and they can get in trouble and so on and so forth if they don't do it the right way. It's not like they have an absolute sort of like, I don't like you, so I'm going to shoot you. Like, that's just not the way it should work. So there aren't that many, you know, I don't have a fully worked out answer. And in fact, if you go to wt.social, which is my new social platform, that is a pilot project where I'm actually trying to figure all these things out. I'm just saying, look, what if we have a platform where we really devolve power into the community? And so like all posts can be edited, or nearly all. We have, you know, we're experimenting with things. So if you see somebody writing something abusive, you can hide it, you can edit it, you can, you know, there's a lot of different options. And, you know, it's a pilot project. So we're experimenting. And so far, I will say what we've managed to achieve so far is people are actually quite nice to each other on the platform. I haven't seen, you know, people aren't being abusive, and it's nothing like that. But it's a small community, and it's not really, I think we've got a lot of software problems we need to solve. And, you know, like there's a lot of details. So I don't pretend I've got the solutions to all this, but where I find it interesting to explore is around devolving power into the community. Whatever that might mean in a given context it just depends. But that, for me, that's the real answer.
Thank you so much. I mean, you know that we also, you know, basically outsource a lot of the norm sustenance to the community, because they are smarter than one moderator would be to flag if something is misaligned with our, you know, ethos. I'm going to go to Balaji now with the mic, who might need to leave early. Floor is yours.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so Jimmy, so first, just to preface, on things like math or computer science, there's an unambiguous absolute truth. And I really appreciate Wikipedia on those kinds of things. But in other areas, there are kind of conflicts of interest. I want to kind of talk through one example, which you might be familiar with. There's this site called Wikipediacracy, and it claims that a Wikipedia editor named Tenebrae with 150,000 edits was pursuing a grudge against a trans person named Peppermint, and basically kept adding their pre-transition name to the page against Peppermint's wishes. And eventually, after this long edit war, Tenebrae allegedly published an article in Newsday under their real name, Frank Levis, and then came back to Wikipedia and cited it as a reputable source because it mentioned Peppermint's real name in the Newsday article, which is on the reputable sources list, thereby arguably like sort of abusing the concept of third-party validation or decentralization or what have you, because they're basically citing themselves. Now, Levis, again, I haven't checked this for myself, Wikipediacracy says this, has also reputedly mentioned themselves, edited themselves into Wikipedia, edited their own page, adding mentions all over the encyclopedia, making themselves as prominent as famous folks like Roger Ebert, which is like the winners write history type of thing. So, my question to you is, how common is that kind of thing in your view? And how do you, resolve that kind of thing?
Well, so I don't think it's very common. I actually hadn't heard half of that story, but I had heard about somebody who has listed an actual, is that the same person, or is that two different stories?
That's one same story. If you want, I'll paste in the link into chat here so you can see it. So
well, I had heard this story about someone who actually is a writer who writes movie reviews and is not exactly the equivalent of Roger Ebert in terms of being famous, who had added a lot of links to themselves. I'm vaguely aware of that story. The other part of it I hadn't heard. I'll have to look into that. No, so that is a good example of what I would call extremely bad behavior that should not be tolerated in Wikipedia. I would suggest, though, I always take things that I hear from Wikipediacracy with a bit of a grain of salt, because they've got a huge axe to grind because they hate Wikipedia. And so sometimes things that come from there are quite one-sided, but sometimes there aren't. The thing is, my view is, if you hear a criticism, you have to take it seriously and sort of thoughtfully look through it. I hadn't heard that one. That's interesting. And what I would hope to see is, we do have rules against conflict of interest editing. But I would suggest as well, if it's someone who's got tens of thousands of edits, it's probably one of the cases I was talking about earlier that the community does struggle with. The question of, okay, this person is clearly, there's a problem here, i.e. they're self-promoting, which we very much frown on. At the same time, they have done a lot of great work. And it's a hard problem. It's a hard problem because oftentimes they've made a lot of friends in the community. And so their friends, we all tend to overlook a little bad behavior by our friends where we wouldn't overlook it with others. I'm not saying that's a good thing. I'm just saying if we're objective about human beings, it's not uncommon. And so, yeah, I don't know. I mean, this is part of why we have the arbitration committee, which is the, sort of elected more senior, like Supreme Court. And we've been careful over the years to try to make sure that the arbitration committee, they have fairly long terms so they can be more independent, et cetera, et cetera. There's a lot of thinking around that governance piece, which is to say, you don't want an arbitration committee that's absolutely sort of beholden to the popular whim of what people are wound up about this month. You want them to sort of step back and think in a more longer term. So anyway, I don't know. I would have to look into that one.
Could I ask one quick follow-up, if that's okay?
Sure.
I believe there was a BLP policy a while ago which would allow people to delete their pages. And some people, like Zuckerberg, initially he had Face Mash, right, where he had profiles of people put up without their consent, right, before he did Facebook. He kind of scraped the Harvard Facebook and put up those pages, and then people rated them or what have you next to it. And it's not the same. Wikimedia is a nonprofit rather than a for-profit, but it does raise money from running donation banners next to people's profiles. Could somebody like Peppermint, for example, just opt out of Wikipedia and be able to delete? This was actually a policy that was proposed a while back. That might be one resolution. I'm wondering what you thought of that.
Yeah, no, so I would say that the key there is that when we think about deletion discussions or biography discussions, one factor to consider that I think many people do consider quite validly is sort of a question of human dignity. the wishes of a subject will have some impact. At the same time, you know, if we get a demand or a request, even a very friendly and polite request from Donald Trump to please remove his Wikipedia entry because he doesn't like it anymore, sorry, but no, like that's not going to happen. And so the ultimate decision about whether something should be in Wikipedia or not has to be around whether the person is notable. You know, if it's part of history, it's part of an encyclopedia, it is important. So I don't know who Peppermint is, but if we're talking about someone who's had major third-party press coverage, you know, been in the New York Times and on the cover of Newsweek, or, you know, I'm just making things up, then yeah, no, that's the very little chance. If we're talking about somebody who is marginal as to whether we should even have a biography, then I think a case could be made. Like if the person doesn't want to be in Wikipedia, then I think many people would say, yeah, actually, it's a marginal case anyway. And then there are other elements that probably don't apply in this case, but are probably worth mentioning if we're going to treat this subject comprehensively, which is we have a policy called BLP1E, because we love an acronym, which is biography of a living person who is notable or famous for one event. And so typically what we're talking about is a random person who is a victim of a crime. So they were otherwise a private person who they've never been in the newspapers, they've never published anything, et cetera, et cetera. You wouldn't think of them as someone who would be covered by an encyclopedia, but now they've become the victim of a famous crime. And typically we will say, we shouldn't have those. Those aren't biographical entries, they aren't valid. Now, that's a presumption which you can rebut in various ways. But what it means is, we will say, look, that there's not enough known about these people typically to write a real biography. How can you write a biography of someone who's only famous because they were murdered, for example? And this leads to a certain kind of naming convention, which sometimes people have misunderstood and don't like, and I'm slightly sympathetic to that, but I don't have a better answer. So we don't have a biographical entry about Meredith Kirchner, who was murdered in Italy in the famous Amanda Knox trial and all of that. We have an entry called The Murder of Meredith Kirchner, because it's an article about the event, not about the person, because frankly, there's not much known about her as a person, and she didn't do anything notable in her life where she would normally have a biography in Wikipedia. She was an ordinary college student who got murdered, and that's a tragedy, but we can't really write an entry about her. That can change. There are people who are notable for only one event, but then they go on to become notable oftentimes as an activist around that. So, you know, people, maybe a parent of someone who was killed will go out and become an activist and therefore establish a reputation that would be worthy of a Wikipedia entry. So that's another element of deletion. But again, it's one of these things that, and this is really where the human nature of Wikipedia comes in. You know, sometimes people say, oh, do you think algorithms could write Wikipedia entries in the future? And I'm like, well, there's some really hard problems. Questions, particularly around borderline questions of, here's someone who doesn't want to be in Wikipedia. They're kind of borderline. They've had a little bit of press coverage, but it's not that important that Wikipedia have it. It's not like a Barack Obama wants out of Wikipedia or something like that. And then we have to make a judgment call. And that's, you know, it's a discussion, a debate. And for me, this is where the most fundamental, when I think about what is our job at the Wikimedia Foundation, it's the health of that community. In other words, do we have thoughtful, kind people chewing on these issues? They're very hard. There's no simple answers like, oh, if you don't want to be in Wikipedia, we'll take your entry down. Well, not if you're really, you know, like historically important. We can't and we shouldn't. But we should, if, you know, if we can, if there's not a good reason to keep you in there.
I mean, biographies are incredibly interesting when it's of a living person, right? I mean, I remember we discussed, there was that issue with the writer Philip Roth, right, who was campaigning.
Great. I don't want to dominate the conversation, but I have some other questions later if after other people come.
We'll come back to you after two other questions. Is that okay, Balji? Stay up. So I remember discussing that even if it's you and your work, you can't just email Wikipedia and be like, oh, I didn't say there, I said it there. You have to provide a source, right? Because it's not your Facebook profile that you just edit at your whim. There is a consensus building going on and other people have to kind of, back you up.
Yeah, I mean, there have been cases where, someone famous emailed us from, happybunny@gmail, I just made that up, and says, oh, this is me, I'm this person. And it's like, you've just emailed from happybunny@gmail, how do we know? And then they get offended, but it's like, I mean, surely you wouldn't want us to just accept the word of any random Gmail address. But we do say to people, sometimes actually a valid thing to do, but it's hard for people who are in the public eye. A valid thing to do is if something is wrong and it's not that important, you can just put it on your personal Twitter or blog, and that will probably be good enough. If it's not a big deal, you can't just, and if it is a big deal, at least if you've published somewhere your response to something, then that should be covered in Wikipedia. So.
Sometimes it's positive, like my father has some entry about him on IMDb that is super positive, and he has no idea who was that. It must have been a friend from like the 70s. And it's like just like one of those lovely Easter eggs that the internet can give you. I'm going to take a couple of questions. Guys, if you have to leave early, let me know, because that kind of also affects the order. But I'm going to Tom now, who's been waiting for a while. Thank you so much.
Hi, Jimmy. I'm a huge fan of Wikipedia. I use it all the time. And on the whole, I find it very accurate. But I want to ask a question about a neutral point of view and how neutral is likely to change for different communities, like going back to that point of Anna's. So in the United States right now, it seems to me that we're getting these two different ways of looking at the world. There's what you might call the blue way and the red way. The blue way is very much more trusting of academic authority and scientific consensus, whereas the blue way distrusts authority. And of course, the difference between these two communities has gotten amplified through the Trump era. But I can see it getting worse, and I believe it's going to become more of an issue for you. And right now, I would say that Wikipedia very much skews to the blue way. And you see this in entries about climate and vaccines, where there's there's very much of an appeal towards a scientific consensus. And in my view, like 20 or 40 years ago, when I was studying science, that no one would have thought that that's a meaningful way of talking about science, but it's become the norm for blue households. And I just wonder at what point we're going to run into different worldviews and how you're going to handle that, because I think it's going to become a flashpoint more than it has.
So yeah, I mean, I think that's right. And I think it's a really interesting thing to chew on. So one of the ways I approach that question is to look at particular examples that we've seen around the world, where we see between different countries, for example, there can often be a different perspective on some historical event. We can choose really hard ones or really easy ones. I was told I can't read the relevant languages, but I was told by a very senior member of parliament in Lithuania that there's a story in Wikipedia about a famous battle that took place between Lithuania and Poland about 100 years ago. And what he told me is that the Lithuanian version tells the story from a Lithuanian perspective, as every Lithuanian learns when they were in school. And the Polish version tells the story from the Polish perspective, as everyone learned when they were in school. And that, in fact, it is a legitimate historical conflict. Like serious historians may not agree on all the things. So it's an active, real issue. He said he's a very learned guy who, for an American, like he's European, he speaks so many languages, but he said the German Wikipedia entry was just very short, so it didn't really give him anything. And then the English Wikipedia, he said, was incredible because it explained the debate. And he's like, it felt like the Lithuanians and the Poles met in English Wikipedia and really thoughtfully worked out how to explain what the issue is. And I thought, wow, that's fantastic. That's good to know. There are other examples like that. So there's I don't remember the name of it, but there's an island, kind of a rock really, in the sea between Japan and Korea, and they each claim sovereignty over it. And they have a debate, but it's not that important. I mean, frankly, it's one of those things that countries love to but whatever. Japan and Korea aren't about to go to war over this rock, but they have a disagreement. And apparently Korean Wikipedia and Japanese Wikipedia tell the story in very different ways. So in these cases, what we hope happens is that a good, thoughtful Wikipedian, right, who can understand both languages, can come in and say, okay, we can't take one side of the story on either case. We need to explain what the debate is about. That's the goal. That's the ideal for Wikipedia. Now, that's not the same thing, right, as the problem that you are talking about, but I think it sheds a little light on it anyway. Because, one of the problems, I would say, it was very easy, I would say, in the past. If you say, look, actually, the New York Times leans left and the Wall Street Journal leans right, okay? But there, I would say, would be fairly universal agreement by any sensible people that they're both quality newspapers. And they're thoughtful and they're thorough and they do their fact checking and so on. And actually, if you want to sort of address a debate they're having, you can do that. Like that is easy to cope with. If you're from, I would say, you were calling it blue for sort of, and then, but these days you've got, I mean, really kind of people are believing fairly outrageous things, and they're following not sort of, oh, they believe more in capitalism because they read the Wall Street Journal. No, they believe crazy things because they're reading low quality Breitbart and sort of nonsense news outlets. And that's a problem. It's a problem for society. It's a problem. I think ultimately it's going to be a problem for the right in the US, which I come from an era, in the 80s where it felt like they were winning a lot of the intellectual arguments around how to manage the economy, around freedom of expression and democracy around the world. Maybe you don't agree with that, but the point is there was an intellectual heft around a lot of the conservative thought at that time. That's just poof, it's evaporated. And, that's a problem. That's not our fault. But we will eventually, there is a question of how do you cope with that? If you have a large group of people, and I think our way of coping with it is to say, well, we're not going to drop our quality standards. How many people believe something there's no evidence for isn't indicative of it being true. And so I think this does start to get a little bit at the heart of what is a fact? What does it mean to be true? And I have a perspective which is, I think that the world exists, that reality is real, and that statements are true to the extent that they describe the facts of reality. And, it's like very kind of old-fashioned Aristotelian, however you want to describe it, and we could get into details. But I also think it's quite the common sense view of most normal people. They just think, is a bus coming down the street or not? And if I step in front of it, I'm going to get killed. Like, that's just like, this is not a matter of ideological opinion. This is just some basic facts about the world. And, because of that, I think you can have standards of quality that are meaningful. and to say, just because there's a screaming headline, accusing someone of something with no evidence given and so on and so forth, that, so what? Like, that's just nonsense. And so, but I think you're also asking really a more practical, I would say, sociological question or a people question about Wikipedia and about the world in general. Like, let's suppose that on this call, probably we might end up in various places on the political spectrum, but we probably all would consider ourselves people who are engaged in ideas and thinking about facts. Are we about to be overwhelmed and enter some sort of a new dark age with the rise of forces of irrationality and madness? I hope not. I don't think so. I'm an optimist, right? Such that, I think we've been through and aren't finished with a sort of a cycle of, it's sort of astonishing, and I'm sorry to rant so much about Donald Trump in particular, right? To have
it's going on our YouTube, so
yeah, I mean, who just lied, unbelievably, ridiculous falsehoods, and it wasn't, just to give an example that I can be a little controversial here. I think when Trump changed the corporate tax rate to be in line with Europe, i.e. cut it, that wasn't a completely crazy sort of, that is a defensible policy thing to say corporate taxes were too high in the US compared to Europe and blah, blah, blah. Now, obviously, at some point you have to get money, so probably they should have raised personal, but that's a whole other story. But I'm like, that's not that is a political question, even questions around, okay, what should any country do about questions about immigration? Like, how open or closed should you be about allowing people to come to? Perfectly valid discussion, and you can debate it. And there's all kinds of things we've seen here in the UK, obviously, huge kind of debates and questions with Brexit and all of that. And it's like, I really don't mind, as long as we're debating these things and we've got a shared understanding of reality, at least mostly. We've got a shared set of values, not around what answers we're going to get to, but around a process for getting to answers. Maybe I don't agree with this politician, but they won the election, so I'm going to be, that's fine. And suddenly it does start to feel a little wobbly around the edges. It's like, it's if your belief system is so different from mine that we even have a hard time understanding the facts. Immigration, for example. If you believe, Mexico's sending murderers and rapists over, and that's basically who they are, a bunch of criminals. And I believe, actually the crime rate of Mexican immigrants to the US is lower than the crime rate of police officers. So maybe it's not that big of a problem. And if we don't even come to some sort of, maybe you lean one way or the other on that question, and we could look at different data. So if we're just completely we have nothing in common, I can't understand you at all because you're speaking nonsense, I don't know how we get back to an answer. And I do think this is one of the core problems around what's going on in social media. And in particular, I can go on a whole rant about what I find really fascinating is algorithmic programmatic advertising, which in some ways is a great thing. I always, I gave my boat example earlier, but literally I get boat ads all over the internet because I read boat magazines and they figured out I like boats. They're boats I can't afford, so it's like boat porn, but I click on it, it all makes sense, right? And that's harmless enough. It's actually a good thing if people are sending me ads that are relevant to me. There's nothing wrong with that. But what we see is really a really interesting kind of micro-targeting around political issues that is really hard to understand. So journalists can't, in the old days, you're going to run a political campaign and you've got a large public message and you basically, depending on the voting system and all of that, but you've got to appeal to the center. You've got to get all your base, but then kind of reach across the aisle and get a majority. And now, so I was chatting with Chelsea Clinton, and this was just after the Trump election. And she was telling me that they had seen ads, very highly targeted ads of like that would contradict things. I mean, basically there was the effective message of some of the ads were, you know, where you live, Hillary's going to win anyway. So, but we know you're they were targeted at Black evangelical Christian women. And they were saying Hillary is pro-abortion and you're not. So you can vote, you don't have to vote for Hillary. You can send a message. She's going to win anyway, don't worry, but she'll have a lower turnout. Like that's the type of ads. And they're micro-targeting. I've heard, I haven't seen complete confirmation that here in the UK, before Brexit, there were ads basically targeted at vegans saying, finally, when we're out of the EU, we can pass animal rights legislation. And ads targeted at hunters saying, finally, when we're out of the EU, we can bring back fox hunting. And it's like, they're completely contradictory messages. But if you can micro-target and you can do it at scale, then suddenly this idea, in order to win an election, you have to have a broad central vision and get most people to buy into it as a thing to do. That goes away. So suddenly people, I'm voting for you because I believe you care about my issues. Anna's voting because she thinks, well, the main thing this person is going to be good for is stopping Jimmy Wales's crazy ideas, right? And so we're voting for the same person, but for opposite reasons, let's say. And that's really bad. And the problem is journalists who try to look into this, it's very hard. You know, it's like, you know, one of the interesting things that I've seen, and I don't know enough about this one yet, is apparently TikTok, there's more political content than I would have ever realized on TikTok. Because, I don't know, TikTok figured out I'm not interested in political
Instagram
content.
as well. Teen politicizing is on Instagram.
To me. But I mean, I use Instagram in a funny kind of way. I don't follow any celebrities, and for whatever reason, I don't get any ads on Instagram. I think they've got me on a, you know, some VIP thing, so I don't see ads.
You're out
So I
of the
just see my
second.
friends. Like I see literally pictures from my friends. That's all I see. So I love Instagram, but I know my experience is unusual. On TikTok, I get a lot of cooking videos. I love to cook, and I like the cooking
They
videos.
know you. They know your politics. When a political candidate will be sold to you, saying that this person knows the right proportion
When
of
I first got on,
garlic, then what?
there's a lot of girls dancing on TikTok. That's a big part of TikTok. When I first got on, I thought, oh, this is kind of creepy, like little girls dancing. They went away. Now it's grown women dancing, right? They figured out I wasn't interested in little girls dancing. That's creepy. So, but that's fine. But what it means is my experience of TikTok, right, is completely different from some other people's experiences of TikTok. And I think the same thing is true often of YouTube, although YouTube moves slower because it's longer form videos. But, you know, well, what do we do about that? How do we think about that? I don't know. I don't think you can ban TikTok. And I don't think TikTok is fundamental. It's short form content. People are having fun. There's nothing really wrong with it. But what is interesting, so where I do think there is a potential for some interesting regulation here is around transparency, particularly for spending. So the idea being, if people are funding, basically it's advertising, and they're not being transparent about who's funding it or that it's even advertising, then I think that's a problem, and that's something that where we could get some progress, I would say. But I'm really way off on a tangent. I don't even know how I got on that. But.
I don't know if you were there. I did an event in London, a Newspeak House, where we just asked people to bring their phones and everybody to bring up their Facebook. This was when people still had Facebook on their phone. And it was basically the same demographic, like Shoreditch, everybody's a hacker or in some ways related to tech, you know, a very kind of libertarian or left-wing audience, and locally, you know, kind of like location-wise centered in the same place. And at first, people were quite reluctant. We were using this app called AirParrot to kind of, you know, project it on the wall. And then people kind of got into it. And all we did, we put the feeds next to one another from Facebook. This was before the election in the UK, and people were shocked. Like literally everybody's Facebook was completely different, but so different that, you know, if you don't actually spend your time thinking about it or writing about it, it was shocking to people. And everybody thought that their version was the version and that everybody else sees the same. And then you have to actually like put it next to one another, which never happens, right, to see the difference. But I like this idea of shuttle democracy as well. So the Lithuanian and the Polish with their battle, and then there's the lingua franca, the external third party to kind of like align the notions. And your bust example, I don't know if you guys are familiar with Alan Sokal, this big in 1990s, the big scandal against continental philosopher, the continental philosopher community. He has this line in his essay that if anybody doesn't believe in gravity, they are welcome to come up to my office at NYU on the 42nd floor and take the window. So there's a hard way to verify things. I'm going to go to Eloy, then back to Balaji, and then to Wes. Hi, Eloy.
Hi. Yeah, I think that now we're talking a little bit about social media. I think I wanted to make a question about what are the because the thing is that, Jimmy, you said something that you contrasted two different points of view, right? You said that in the beginning like Wikipedia is a place where people reflect and try to listen to other people, and that social media is a place where people keep agitating, right? So basically, in those two terms, people like are using two different types of thinking because like, and I'm thinking here about the Kahneman book, right? The thing is that the system one thinking, which is emotion, which is a type of thinking, right? It's people that usually go on Twitter and like just start saying, I hate you, but they're thinking in a way that's perhaps is sort of basic, but they're using some sort of intuition and some mental process to at least process a part of their reality. But then when you go to Wikipedia, you try to use the system two thinking, which is pause and reflective and all that. And my question is, how do you, it's like those things, system two thinking actually takes time. It's labor intensive. How do you create a space for that? Because the thing is that it's just so like right now where people are like in TikTok and they're just like seeing things for 2 minutes and they're like, oh, I want to see this, and I just devote like a minute to the video. People don't devote time to things anymore. So how do you make people like, I don't know, like devote time to other people? And
like the Scandinavians, they're slow TV, you know, the slow TV in Scandinavia where they just watch the fire with these logs all day and that's all.
I don't like that's awesome, but how do you able to create institutions that pretty much like make people like just like drool over the log? Like I don't know, like just like to engage with other people. That's my question.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're optimistic about the length of videos on TikTok. It's more like 15 seconds, but yeah, I mean, it's interesting because I do think, you know, I'm not in any way an expert on brains, so I'll just say it's kind of a common way of thinking, but I'm not sure how scientifically valid it is. It's sort of like your reptilian brain versus your Aristotelian brain, and you know, I think we can all, you know, it's quite easy. I actually deleted TikTok from my phone because I found I could spend too much time on it because it's very addictive. It is addictive, right? And if you're not enjoying something, you flick to the next and you flick to the next. And then pretty soon they learn what you like. And then you're seeing content that you think is funny or interesting. And they've got all the signals from everybody and all of that. But ultimately it's like junk food. You know, if I had a can of Pringles here at the beginning of this, they would be gone by now. Like it's junk food, right? I know it's junk food, so I don't have a can of Pringles here. And so, you know, what I think is interesting though, is that as human beings, we actually do desire both. We do want to know, we want to learn, we want to reflect. And when we look at Wikipedia's popularity, it's enormous, right? It's by far the most popular content website in the world. I mean, the others are all functional utilities. So it's more popular than any newspaper. It's more popular than the top 20 newspapers as far as I'm aware. And so what does that mean? That means you know, a lot of people are using it. A lot of people they want to have that experience, and they probably also are using Twitter and TikTok and YouTube and things like that in a different moment of their life. And it's just the same as, like, you know, when I sit down to watch television, yeah, sometimes I really want to watch you know, everybody's been raving about this very intellectual drama, and I'm going to really get absorbed in it and sometimes I just want to watch Schitt's Creek because it's funny, although it's clever. So I get that. I don't, you know, I have friends who watch Love Island, or is that what it's called? Love Island? I mean, it's terrible. I saw one episode. I'm like, this is ridiculous, right?
You're asking the wrong crew. We never watch crappy TV. All we do is so intellectual.
There's nothing wrong with that, right? Like, we're human beings. We have a lot of diverse interests and needs. If you want to sort of sit and do something frivolous for a while just to chill out, like, that's cool with me. I think the problem is if those things are dominant, and it's the same thing. It's like, if you think about your physical health, there's actually nothing wrong with eating Pringles now and then, or having some French fries or whatever, but it shouldn't be your whole diet, right? Candy bars and McDonald's and Coca-Cola, not a proper diet. And so thinking about how do we design things that people find both interesting, right, but are also more nutritional, it's a great challenge. And it's really what I think Wikipedia is, right? I think Wikipedia, it's not perfect, but I think we'll all agree it's like a great place to go and learn things and chew on ideas and so on and so forth, and dig into things you don't know about. And it's very popular. But when I think about, like, WT Social, where I'm trying to do something similar in the social space, well, I haven't succeeded yet, right? It's not popular. It's a niche thing, and I've got a few people and so on, and that's great. Or we think about what we're doing here tonight, Interintellect. It's fantastic.
Another thing that shouldn't work, right? If somebody tells you, like, come together for 3 hours and talk about the hardest topics in the world with your video on after work, people would be like, no, nobody would come.
No, but I'm actually interested in, and I've been wanting to have a long call with you just to chat about this. I'm interested in how could we imagine this sort of thing at a bigger scale? So if you think about, so here's my example. So on WT Social, we divide things into what we call a subwiki. So it's like subreddits on Reddit, but it's a subwiki because everything's editable. And one of the subwikis that somebody started when we first got started and boomed for a little while is about beekeeping. Okay, about 100 people joined. So I was vaguely thinking I might like to get a beehive, so I joined, and it's basically dead. Like, nobody posts. You know, I think partly because in the early days we were really focused on news, and I can tell you how much news comes out about bees and beekeeping in particular. None. Like, there's no news. It's not a news topic, but it's a topic, right? It's a hobby. It's something that people are interested in. And what I've been thinking about is, like, take what we're doing tonight and imagine, and this is very local, very community. This is not the next sort of Facebook worth $1 billion idea, but why shouldn't that group of people, 100 people random around the world, maybe one of them, probably more than one of them, is a very experienced beekeeper who's retired, 70 years old, has been keeping bees for 40 years. And then there's young people or new people who want to keep bees, but they don't really know how. Could that person hold a weekly seminar, right? Where on Saturday evening, Saturday morning, they hold a seminar, and maybe sometimes 4 people show up, and maybe sometimes 10 people show up, which, by the way, on a local level, there is a beekeeping organization here in the UK, and I found out they do have local meetups, right? Why shouldn't they be on Zoom? Why shouldn't people be doing that? And then when I think about this, and so this is where I can get into, thinking about that it's partly about the knowledge element, where you were talking about, like, sort of system 1, system 2, but it's also, so during lockdown, my family, and we live all over the world now because I've moved away from America, and my siblings have moved in different places in America. We started doing a weekly pub quiz on Zoom. And so we take turns, and my mom loves it, so we can't stop even if we're tired of it, because mom loves it. So we do it every week. And what's interesting about it is this. So we talked about Instagram. I have a great experience on Instagram. I only see my friends and I don't see any ads. Okay, let's compare this. Now my sister, I see every week. and we joke around with the family, right? We joke about stuff that we did when we were kids. We tease each other if we get a question wrong, or whatever. We got running jokes. It's a social experience with my family that's been lovely. And now I compare it to a few years ago, where, by the way, this technology has existed for quite some time, but nobody did it before lockdown. Like, that taught us all we can have a meeting on Zoom if we want to. But before that, like, what did I do that was social online with my sister? I clicked like on her dog pictures on Instagram, right? And it's like, why on earth do we call that social media? Like, how social is that? Oh, cute dog picture, here's a heart, it's like, yay. And I'm like, okay, let's actually think, and this is where I'm coming around to with WT Social, but also why I'm a big fan of Interintellect, is like, actually, this is far more interesting, right? It's far more engaging, whether it's family just joking around, right? Whether I've just met you, Eloy, we're having a conversation about ideas, which we might have had we met, sort of at an event or something like that, which we haven't, so we meet here, and that's great. It's just, is there an opportunity? And it doesn't have to be like super high level, like let's talk about the SoCal hoax and Derrida, right? No, like, most people don't care about that stuff at all, right? But maybe we get together and we talk about beekeeping or gardening. We talk about, like, actually they are intellectual topics, right? But they're more practical, they're more wide scale. Maybe we get together and we chat about sports. I mean, I won't be coming, thank you very much, but people might. And so
I will be busy that day. I will be busy that day. That's
no, but I think it's very interesting to say.
It is, yeah.
We've been in this weird.
We already have the beekeepers starting their Interintellect salons, and that's fantastic. This is how.
Yeah. Where we talk about, like, what we've called social media has been so thinly social, so not social at all. And even the things that are slightly more long form, they tend to be more broadcast. So they're about, like YouTubers who become famous, TikTokers who become famous, and they're producing content that's entertainment, but it's broadcast. It's not social, and not in that sense, right? It's only social in the sense that, yeah, I could post a TikTok video, but nobody wants to see me dancing, I'm sure.
Everybody would watch that. Please do that. I really love the.
I mean, it might go viral, but for the wrong reasons.
It would go viral, yeah. Maybe not for the right reasons. I mean, we don't know how you dance. Maybe it would be amazing, especially if it's ballet. Please, Swan Lake. I really love the food metaphor here. I think there's this idea that junk food first kind of conquered America and ruined everybody's health, and it was hyper addictive, and everything was designed from the red color, red, yellow, sodium, eat, right? Bottomless sodas. And then people became smarter and they became used to it, and it became less of a sensation. And today, if you meet a young American in a big city, they will be annoyingly self-conscious about what they eat and talk to you about broccoli for 5 hours, right? And I think Interintellect in some senses is maybe the gastropub level of the evolution of our tastes, that people are like, no, I don't want a transient experience. I want an intentional and high investment experience, because if I invest, then other people invest as well, and I also get more intellectually, emotionally, socially. So I think I like this idea that social media is not social at all.
Yeah. No, it's fast food, and also there is like the slow food movement. And I think that analogy really works. I mean, the slow food movement, I think.
Yeah, the slow food, I love that.
Yeah,
but
exactly.
suitable for vegans.
Yeah, it's like there's fast social media and slow social media, maybe. I don't know. But.
Love that. Thank you so much. I'm going to Balaji and then to Wes. Thank you so much.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So, so Jimmy, this is not meant to be like a trolley kind of question. It's a serious question, but so historically, Wikipedia has prized itself on being an unpaid volunteer project. However, as you might be aware, one of the criticisms of open source projects is that they are disproportionately white, male, and Western, because those are the demographics on a global scale, with the wealth to have the leisure time to do this kind of volunteer work. So suppose there was a crypto version of Wikipedia, which preserved the decentralization and other aspects, but allowed people to get paid for editing, perhaps with a token of some kind, and thereby opened up the possibility of paid editing roles to people in non-Western countries that may not have the wealth to be able to work for free, but now they do have internet connections, which they might not have, 20 years ago or even 10 years ago. So basically the argument is that if it's not paid editing, it's subsidized editing in at least some way. So, does that flip the ethical imperative around paid editing, around in your view? Why?
So I think we can separate two things out. We can tease these things apart. One is the crypto piece, right? And one is the paid piece. Because the crypto piece, to me, sort of automatically brings with it a lot of interesting complications around who's paying, who's getting paid, how transparent is that, what is the control mechanism. And it's not necessary. Like, there's literally no reason you would need that. One of the things that we can imagine us doing, the Wikimedia Foundation doing, is going to a promising smaller language, let's say Swahili. So Swahili Wikipedia is, I haven't looked recently, but it's thriving. It's small, but it's thriving. I think I should look, but anyway, I'm on the Zoom. But it's tens of thousands of articles, maybe 50,000 by now, maybe 25,000. I haven't looked in a long time. But it's, there's a community there, and they're working on Swahili Wikipedia. And Swahili is a regional language, so a lot of people speak a local language and Swahili. So why couldn't we go out to universities, right? Give college scholarships to students of the same kind of demographics in terms of the age and so on that's typical for Wikipedians who are college students, grad students, subsidize their college education, get them to do a certain amount of Wikipedia editing every week, and bring in, let's get 200 people active editing Wikipedia entries in Swahili. I think that would be super interesting. That is a project I would be very supportive of. And the idea would be they would be paid on a scholarship type of basis. There would have to be some quality controls and some thoughts, because obviously some people will take the money and just type nonsense, right? You want to be careful of that. That's just a fact, right? So as soon as you're paying people, you've got to think about what they're doing and why, but you can devolve that into the community and sort of say, if people are getting blocked, obviously they're going to lose their, whatever. It requires some management. It doesn't sound like an impossibility. Now, the objections you might have to that, even though I support it, right? The objections you might have is the question of, would you thereby kill off the volunteer impulse? Would you thereby potentially introduce some bias if the people making the hiring decisions are choosing people who agree on ideological basis? Like, there's a lot of open questions. I don't think they're insurmountable. So I would say, if somebody said, oh, instead of having, you can look up the numbers, how many people are editing Spanish language Wikipedia? What if we went out and just hired that same number of people to edit Spanish language Wikipedia instead of the volunteers? I would say that's going to be a huge step backwards, like, because now suddenly you've got a group of paid people who are working in a management structure who now have some sort of an advantage over volunteers. If we, on the other hand, say, actually, we're going to try this in geographies where we know people don't necessarily have the leisure time that they have in the West, then I think it's super interesting. And I think it would be great. I don't think it has anything to do with crypto, though, because we have money. We can just give people money, and that's more practical. So.
Thank you so much. I'm going to Wes and then Laura.
Okay, thank you.
Balaji, did you want to do a follow-up? Wes, the floor is yours.
All right, great. I think I would probably just, maybe debate one point which is, Jimmy, you mentioned that crypto wasn't necessary for it, but I think these small amounts to allow them to preserve anonymity, to also give them private keys to encrypt, so on and so forth. So, they can digitally sign things. I might disagree with you on implementation, but that's.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sorry, you're really breaking up, so we're not really hearing you. I don't know if that's affecting everyone or just me, but yeah, I mean, certainly, if someone said, I want to get paid in Bitcoin because transferring money here is hard, yeah, that's just a payment mechanism. If it's like, no, we're going to start a cryptocurrency in a blockchain, and people can insert cash in untraceable ways or very hard to trace ways, suddenly you get into the question of, okay, how much money is the government of this country funneling in to make sure that the entry doesn't, offend the leadership? And by the way, that's a thing around the world. There's real challenges. So it's not a simple question, but certainly like the question of, okay, like we want to hire people in some geography where it's actually expensive or difficult for them to receive money, which by the way is basically a myth and not a problem. But if so, if somebody wants to, if somebody said, oh yes, I live in Kenya, but I'd like to be paid in the British pound. Okay, like I don't care. I live in Kenya, I'd like to get paid in Bitcoin. Okay, that's fine. It doesn't matter to us. It's a way to pay someone. So that I don't have any problem with. But I do have a problem. Like the issue you want to avoid is in all circumstances is that the truth is up for sale. Like that is really what would be toxic, because it's not up for sale.
It is up for sale in other places enough already, right? We don't want to add that.
No, I know it's controversial, but like I just recently joined BitClout, which is an experiment, a social network that has to do with crypto and all that. And it does have, heavily built in. It's all about people giving each other money and so on and so forth. And I'm finding it interesting. I'm not convinced it's going to take over the world, but I think I'm like, I know the problems of Wikipedia. And so I know where there's some real like disastrously bad ideas that could come up. But around social, I just think there are really interesting questions, like let's just give this example. What would TikTok look like if instead of being advertising based and algorithmically driven to ultimately drive ad views, what would it be like if the creators on the platform were getting small amounts of money from the users? Like I would pay for certain content. Let's put it this way. I'll sit and watch for free content that's kind of mindless, but if I'm paying, I'm going to actually demand something more interesting. And is there a way with crypto and technology to actually have micropayments that are like, sure, why not? Like, I don't know the answer. I think that's fascinating.
We'll find out with Clubhouse, right? I mean, this is what Clubhouse is trying to do now. So we will see in a year where that's.
Clubhouse, yeah. I've got a Samsung phone.
Oh, now it's available apparently. So.
Oh, is it? Okay.
You will find the Interntech Lounge. If that's
I might have to download Clubhouse. Before now, I was like, I'm not going to get an iPhone just to get on Clubhouse. So.
Oh, yeah. Maybe that would have been too much. Wes, take the floor.
Yeah, so I was curious if your team has thought very much about the design of the interaction elements, I guess, on the website, and I would also include in that the sort of cultural norms around how editors talk to each other and how this plays out to like change the quality of the content. So like one thing that's striking to me actually is that the authorship of a page is really not front and center at all. Right? Can you imagine, like, you go to Twitter, you see viral tweet, and they don't show you like the account, right?
Yeah.
Like a newspaper that doesn't have bylines, for instance, is going to produce content in a much different way than one that does, right? So I'm curious if that's a thing that you've put some thought into, and also whether or not there have been any interesting situations in which like some kind of a change just sent quality of the content like off the rails.
Okay, yeah, great question.
Are there famous people editing each other's Wikipedia? Does Rihanna go to like Nicki Minaj's and change it, or she sends her publicists?
I hope not. I hope not. No, so we do, yes and no. So what's interesting is that again it goes back to decisions that were made very, very early on, were just made by me on gut instinct, which were like, when Wikipedia was just getting started, blogging was like a big thing. And the idea in a way was, I felt like there are different objectives that people have and also different personality types. So bloggers, they want to write with their byline. They are putting their ideas and thoughts out in the world, and they want their byline, and they want to be credited for that. And Wikipedians are different, right? Wikipedians aren't trying to get, TikTok famous by being a famous Wikipedian. They just want to contribute to knowledge. And what would it mean, if we, for example, highlighted the most active editors on a page, right? What would that do to the dynamics of the community, to the reward structure? I don't think it would be a good thing, but it's an interesting question, right? Obviously, it would have some impact. Right now, what I would say is most Wikipedians do care very much about their reputation with other Wikipedians. So they, a lot of the good behavior at Wikipedia is because there's a certain value system around what it means to be a good Wikipedian. And if you have a reputation for someone who can come into a complicated situation and find a way to neutrally express things and to calm down a debate and to get some quality on the page, that's valued, and you become very well known in the community as being a great Wikipedian, or you become very well known as kind of a pain in the neck, and so that reputation is quite visible to people, but even though it's not sort of on the page. So that's important. I mean, another type of example like that would be a question of, gamification was a popular term a few years ago. It's still a popular concept. What if when people like your edit, they clicked a like and you got some scores, and then you could go around and see who got the most likes? Well, that sounds like a really bad idea to me. And it's one that we've never really seriously considered. But I mean, it has some, if we were struggling to get people to participate, that might be the sort of thing you would do, is to say, well, let people feel some rewards from it. They'll get likes, and that'll be good. And it obviously works on social media platforms. People love to post and get 1,000 likes on their dog picture. But for us, we don't think that's the right answer. And I always compare to this. Imagine you went to a job, a serious professional job, and you had to wear a tag, and the tag had a number saying how many people like you or not, right? That sounds like dystopia, right? It sounds like hell. No one would like that. And so also the dimensions of human judgment around quality are so multivariate, right? Some people are really great Wikipedians because they go off and they do a lot of research and they come back and they write a long piece that's really good. Other people are great Wikipedians because they go around fixing small grammar errors, like thousands of them. Some people are great Wikipedians because they come into a conflict and they find a way to resolution that everybody is happy about. Like, there's so many different skills that any kind of a ranking. So this is, when we think about the design of Wikipedia, and what I call like community design. So it's not just like, oh, it's a very old-fashioned looking website now. Yes, it is, but it's really about what are the affordances, what are the things that are rewarding people, or what is the visibility they're getting into what each other are doing. There's a lot about it that is, I think, quite sensible. It's evolved over a long period of time, or we got lucky and made some good decisions early on. And then there's other elements that are clearly not good, but are really, really hard to change. So as an example, right now, if you go to any Wikipedia page and you want to join the discussion, so you click on the talk page and you see a long discussion, you click edit to participate, and then you have to type like : to indent 5N, right? It's a pain in the neck. It makes no sense at all. Like, why can't I just hit reply and have it indented properly like every other website in the world? Why do I have to hit : ? Well, because every talk page is a wiki page. And can we redesign the talk pages so that the talk page retains the same functionality, i.e. people can remove others' comments if they're being obnoxious, but that's just, yes, we probably could. A few attempts have been made, but they're not popular. It's really hard. And so one of the things that I will say, one of the tensions we've had in the community and the foundation, between the community and the foundation, is that the community tends to be very, very conservative about changes to the user interface. And this is common in any web development. People are used to how it works. I mean, just imagine you change some little thing on Twitter and everybody goes insane, right? And so because of that, certain changes are very, very, very hard to implement because we operate as in a very community-oriented fashion, which works great for lots of things. It does mean that we have a lot of thought put into every single decision. So when you start your question with, has your team thought about, it's like, well, the Wikipedians literally have thought of everything because they're constantly thinking and talking about everything. But are we able to move forward in certain ways? I think it's very hard, just because people are very conservative about the software. There are a couple of examples. So we changed to, I think it's called the media viewer, but in the past, when you clicked on a photo in Wikipedia, you went straight to the photo upload page, which is kind of an ugly, very practical page. Now when you click, it goes up into a light box and has the basic information, and you click one more time to get to the, whew, that was a controversial move. I mean, people went crazy about it. And in the end, it's stuck, and people do think it's better. It's better for readers, but it might not be better for editors. And so we struggle with a lot of those kinds of things. I'll give one more example, which isn't so much about software design, but what I would call more about community design. And that is the question of, how do you become an administrator? Let's particularly go to English Wikipedia as the largest. It's really hard to become an administrator. And it's an unpleasant process to get through because people go through and scrutinize your every edit to make sure you're a nice person who represents the values of Wikipedians, which means there's a fair number of like really good contributors who I think would make great admins, and they're just like, no thanks, I don't want to go through the gauntlet of becoming an admin. And there is a general consensus, I would say, that we need more admins. Okay, so now we've got this weird situation where, and this has, by the way, been going on for years and years and years, everybody agrees we need more admins, but nobody agrees how we should do it. And so therefore we are kind of paralyzed. I think we'll get through that eventually. I think something will happen, but we're well past the point where I can come in and go, okay, there's a consensus, we need more admins. Nobody can agree how, so I'm just gonna choose, and here's a method, and I'm gonna make certain people admins, and no, that's impossible now. That would not happen. It would be as crazy as the Queen in the UK suddenly exercising her powers, whatever they might be. It would be a very bad idea.
Yeah, that seems like that might be like a long-term cultural problem, right? Like, are admins aging out? Like, you know, are more people leaving than? Yeah.
A little gray hair myself, so no, it is a long term. I'm not sure it's a cultural problem in the sense that it's not that the admin core is defending itself by not allowing new admins. I don't think that is the dynamic of it. Maybe it is a bit that, not from that intention, but just from, well, we know what we're doing, and unless you know what you're doing, how could you be an admin? And it's like, well, how can you learn how to be an admin unless you try it for a while? So I mean, some of my proposals have been, you know, let's give out provisional admin bits. So let people become admins for a 2-month trial and then have the gauntlet, you know? So like, as long as you've got, you know, sort of 10 endorsements from reasonable people, you become an admin. And then if you screw it up, we de-admin you because it was, you know, there's a lot of, but no one can agree on exactly how to do that. And I think eventually somebody will sort of suit up and just like plow forward and campaign and put together a huge community-wide vote, and something will win and we'll move forward. But it's a problem, and it is an interesting thing, and it's not dissimilar, by the way. Like when I think about these things in the abstract and about the design of social systems, here in the UK, we have, in my opinion, a terrible problem with first past the post and how seats in Parliament are allocated. it's nonsense, right? It's complete nonsense. Different, you know, the number of votes that the Lib Dems got in the last election got them this many seats, and the number of votes that S&P got in the last election got them this many seats. It's clearly doesn't make sense, but it's really hard to change. And it's just like all of these kinds of gerrymandering issues in the US and places like that. It's like, if there are people who are used to a certain system and have a vested interest in it, then even as there becomes a sort of a consensus of like, this isn't actually working so well, it's still very hard to change, because how do you get from here to there in a social design system where there isn't a dictator is quite hard.
Okay, thank you.
While you guys were talking, we resolved to create Interact Wikipedia entry and a special pension for old Wikipedia editors. So wait, please, Jimmy, wait for our emails about this. By the way, apparently there are quite a few Wikipedia editors in the room. I edit birth dates because I remember everybody's birth date all the time. So when I spot one that is not correct,
you shouldn't edit about Intellect because you have a conflict of interest.
I'm not going to touch it. I'm not going to touch it.
I'm your friend, so I've got a conflict of interest. It's all very complicated.
Yeah, no. It's like we have enough people in Interact to do that. It's really interesting. We had a salon last summer, almost a year ago, with Nadia Egbal on her book Working in Public, and we were talking about the governance of GitHub, and she was also talking about how important the internal status is, and that many maintainers on GitHub, like editors on Wikipedia, are very much motivated by peer recognition, and that's many times more important after a while than, I don't know how many people read or cited your entries. Just a thought. I'm going to Laura and then Raphael. Thank you so much for your patience.
Yes, I have a question about trust and persuasion, because in the beginning of the salon, something was said about that Wikipedia is a platform for stating facts. And during, times of serious factual turbulence, like with the COVID pandemic the past year, I've personally, and probably many of us here, have experienced that like your own government is saying something different than what Wikipedia is saying. People on Twitter are arguing about it. And like, what the heck is a fact like in those times? And how do you resolve that? And during these times, I really got kind of burned out on finding out what is and what isn't true. And what I found was that the most persuasive media was on Twitter, where people are like sharing these videos of where they do these super simple experiments, for example, like blowing out a candle through a mask. So you can see that the airflow is very restricted, for example. And like, is there a room for this kind of persuasive how and why, as opposed to only the what of what is true on Wikipedia? And anything else? Do you have anything else on the turbulence itself?
Yeah, I mean, so we've talked about that turbulence quite a lot tonight. So I'm not sure what I could add to it other than to say, we're in this weird era. Like, one of the problems I see is that politicians and then a lot of people on Twitter, they're not looking to thoughtfully examine all the evidence and come to a factual conclusion. They're looking to push an agenda which somehow tangentially or somewhat randomly got attached to a certain political position. And therefore, like the wearing of masks in the US has become quite political. And you could easily see that going in a different direction, right? If Trump had said everybody wear a mask, then maybe liberals would be like, I'm not wearing a mask. That's Donald Trump trying to, I don't know, maybe not. But anyway, and then, in terms of type of content and persuasion. So I think that very often one of the things that Wikipedia, one of the reasons that it is persuasive to people is, there are certain things like Wikipedia is more likely to report, the US Center for Disease Control made this recommendation, like that is a factual statement. Like, whether you believe the CDC or not, that's a next level. But because we don't just try to push whatever conclusion, so oftentimes there can be, and as we know there have been from reasonable authorities during this pandemic. There have been contradictory bits of advice at different times for various reasons and so on and so forth. And then we all know, you know, every politician loves to say, we're going to follow the science, but as we all know, scientists don't always agree about everything. And so follow the science might mean different things. And also you can take different stuff. So it's very hard. And so just, I think presenting like clearly the facts and trying to be reasonable about, okay, there are these competing views. Here's who's saying this and who's saying that, and the reasons they're giving, that's very helpful. But also you touch on something really interesting, which is the question of, you know, Wikipedia follows a very traditional kind of encyclopedic model of transmitting knowledge and of what counts as knowledge. And other types of information isn't in Wikipedia. Should it be? I don't think so, but you know, like it's an open question. So as an example, the sort of demonstrating the efficacy of a mask by showing how hard it is to blow out a candle through a mask. I've not heard that. That's really interesting, right? Because when I'm wearing a mask, I believe in wearing masks, but I also feel like that I'm breathing perfectly well. I mean, is this actually doing anything? I'm not sure. And something like that might be more persuasive to me. It might be misleading because I don't know if that's a valid way of testing it, but you know. But I also think about, let's move away from a controversial topic and think about, I love to cook. It's my hobby. I'm pretty good at cooking. I don't learn anything about cooking from Wikipedia. Like Wikipedia doesn't really have good content around cooking, not because we haven't gotten around to it, but because it's not scientific or it's not encyclopedic knowledge. Apparently, I don't know, I haven't checked in a long time, but there was a huge debate. Apparently, French encyclopedias traditionally have had recipes in them. So French Wikipedia, I think, is a little more welcoming to recipes, but even there, they had a hard problem because, okay, let's take a recipe for, I don't know, name your favorite dish, paella, right? You know, it's sort of like if you ask 10 Spaniards for a paella dish, you get 12 recipes, right? There's no correct answer to that question. And so, and for that kind of content, like I turn so YouTube, I turn to YouTube. YouTube has some fantastic cooking videos, and oftentimes I read a recipe, but I don't understand a technique. If you want to learn a technique for, like, I don't know, trimming a fish or something like that, go to YouTube. And that's knowledge, right? That is definitely knowledge in the same sense that learning about what Queen Victoria did is knowledge, but it's not knowledge that Wikipedia deals with or handles very well. And why not? And should it? I don't think it should, but I mean, I think it's a great question. I think it's really interesting. And also, by the way, when we talk about these broader societal issues, one of the things that is true, although Wikipedia is incredibly popular, if you look at the numbers from ComScore or, you know, services like that, typically it varies in different locations and so on and so forth, but about 1/3 of the people on the internet see Wikipedia every month. So in a month's time, 1 out of every 3 people visit Wikipedia. And I mean, I remember one time a reporter is like, isn't that mind-boggling that so many people see Wikipedia? And I'm like, yeah, well, what the hell are the other 2 people doing all month? Like, how are you on the internet for an entire month and you didn't visit Wikipedia even once? And the answer is,
maybe they're in China, no?
Well, no, but this is like in Germany. It's higher in Germany. It's like 38% of Germans read Wikipedia every month. And what are the rest of them doing? And the answer is, we're all, because we're here, I think we're a self-selected group of people who are interested in encyclopedia style learning and knowledge. Other people aren't. It's the same with, and this is what I say, like in open societies, so same with news, voting, information, it's not hard for people who are tracking the news and following the news to recognize a fake news story. I mean, you can be fooled sometimes, but in general, you know, if you see a story, there was one that went viral, Pope endorses Trump, right? Okay, probably not, right? You see the headline and you're like, what is that? And then you look and it's like, I've never heard of that as a newspaper, and you look a little deeper And you're like, if the Pope endorsed Donald Trump, that'd be the front page of every newspaper in the world, and it isn't. Like, you know, if you're an information savvy person, you can get through that. Lots of people aren't. They just share, like and you know what? That is your absolute right. In free societies, not everybody needs to be a politics geek. We might lament that they aren't, but they don't have to be. However, when they do think, like literally, you know, the day before an election, oh, I think I'll vote tomorrow. Who's running? What are the issues, right? I think they deserve to get good information, right? That is the problem, is like, when you suddenly say, oh, I don't really, politics is boring, I'm not that interested. Oh, we're voting? Oh, really? What's it about? If the next thing you see is just like nonsense that your crazy uncle sharing on Facebook, you're not gonna get very far. So people need to be able to look for quality information. And maybe, by the way, because of this, only 1 in 3 people are looking at Wikipedia, maybe the right path for that information may not be reading 10 encyclopedia entries about the candidates. Maybe it is a more visual medium. Maybe it is something else that's more suited to people's tastes or where they're situated, where they live. And right now they're more likely to, you know, find nonsense if that's their mode of getting information. So I think it's an interesting, very interesting question or problem.
Thank you so much. And I can confirm that Jimmy is a great cook. And by the way, I learned so many cocktail recipes from Wikipedia. I got so many people drunk because it's really clearly explained how to make a very strong old fashioned, and they tell you how they did it in like 1962, and that's even more lethal. And then you just kind of put together all this poison. That's perfect. And one of my favorite things about Wikipedia is when you have a developing event, right? So an election or something is happening in the world, and then it's clearly marked that this is being like reality is happening, and that after a while it becomes less, you know, in development, right, as an event, and it becomes the past. And from then on, it becomes something where people will come and edit. But those two things, those two time zones are just extremely interesting, and that you can actually see that happening in front of your face, basically. If you haven't checked that before, when the next big thing happens, head to Wikipedia. I'm going to Raphael and then Ashley. And if there's time, we will also, Raphael and Yuri. And if there's time and Jimmy is willing to stay, then Ashley and Harry at the end. And that's the end of the questions. And sorry, Balaji is saying thank you for the answers, but his internet is cutting off.
Okay.
So Raphael and Yuri.
Hey, Jimmy. So a lot of difficult questions tonight. So my question is a little softer. So the donation model used on Wikipedia, do you think that it hinders any kind of development or exploration of areas related to this encyclopedic theme? And if you could quickly mention, pretty curious to know your favorite Wikipedia page and your favorite fandom page as well.
Favorite, what was the second one?
Your fandom page.
Fandom, okay. Yeah. So the donation model, so here's just to lay it out a little bit for those who may not know. So Wikipedia exists almost exclusively from the small donors. So small donations is the real backbone of it. We do get some grants from foundations and some major donors, but that's a small percentage of the overall money. And I think that's a really good thing, simply because it means that we have intellectual independence, right? Sometimes people say to me, "Oh, why are you asking for money? Why doesn't, like Facebook and Google and Apple should all just give you 50 million each?" Yeah, think really hard before you think you want Wikipedia dependent on Facebook, Google, and Apple. And I say that even though I like people there, like it's not the right model. It's much like, by the way, I'm really happy that Jeff Bezos is financially supporting the Washington Post, but that's not the right model, right? The billionaires sort of owning the press is not really the right answer. It should be, distributed funding. So the donation model is great for us. It is limited to an extent. So the way we run the Wikimedia Foundation is in a very cautious way, conservative way. So every year we bring in a little bit more money than we spend. So we build our reserves every year. The advice, typical advice for nonprofits is to have between 1 to 2 years of expenses as a reserve, and we've got about 18 months, the last numbers I saw. So that's good, it's healthy. But we're also building a separate endowment fund, which is really the long-term fund. It has a separate board, so it's got an extra governance structure, so that it's not just a big bank account for some future profligate CEO to dip into. It has to be sort of approved by another board, which I'm on that board as well. So I'm like the link between the two. And you know, that fund is really about being safe for the long haul. And it turns out that a lot of our donors, it's actually a paradox to many people, but it's something that I find to be very true, is like donors don't want to give if they think you're about to go out of business, right? That sounds like a lost cause. And a little bit of panic can shake a little more money out of people, clearly. But we find that in general, donors are happier donating when they feel Wikipedia is being responsible and safe with the money. And if it's going into a long-term fund to make sure Wikipedia is safe for the long term, that's really important. Now, what it does mean is, although we're financially stable, you know, our budget is 100 million a year, more or less. And so $100 million. Well, what if we had 300 million a year, right? Instead of 100 million, what could we do with an extra 200 million? And the answer is, of course, there's loads of stuff. I mean, just tonight we kind of stumbled across a concept that, you know, we could hire people, hundreds of people, to either write Wikipedia in the languages of the developing world, or maybe they just go out and they recruit on campuses. Maybe we have a massive recruiting program. Maybe we support those communities in a really serious and financially well-funded way. Maybe we do things like, you know, content that's locked up and hard for the public to access. What if Wikipedia could buy all of the archives of scientific journals and set them free? What if Wikipedia could buy Elsevier and stop having proprietary scientific publications and fund it with donation? What could we do? Like, it's interesting, right? On the other hand, if the cost of doing that is, oh, now we're going to take private equity money and we're going to start have an advertising model and start squeezing everybody's data, maybe not so good. Like, I kind of like Wikipedia the way it is. So it's an interesting question. So yeah, of course, it clearly limits us in terms of, as it limits anybody. Like, obviously, if you have 100 million to spend, you can do a lot. If you've got 400 million to spend, you can do 4 times as much. So that's kind of cool. But at what price, right? And if it costs us our soul, then it wouldn't be worth it. And it's actually one of the powerful things about being a nonprofit. So I'm not such a big person on hating things that are for-profit. I mean, fandom, which you asked me to speak about for a second, that's for-profit. Like, there's nothing wrong with companies making money. Like, I'm not. Early in my career, I think a lot of journalists were very disappointed that I wasn't some sort of a wild communist, sort of bashing people for making money, and I gave it all away because no, it's just practical and so on. At the same time, though, as I've said, like, there are certain things that we are able to pursue in a very pure way because we are a nonprofit organization. And I've said to people, I think I'm a perfectly, you know, I'm a good person and I'm very nice and friendly. On the other hand, you know, if you said to me, yeah, Jimmy, if you just put one ad in Wikipedia, you could personally make, you know, 100 million a year, I'd probably take it. You know, like that doesn't sound like a terrible thing to me. But because it's a nonprofit, it's like, well, no, like, I wouldn't even think about that. I wouldn't consider it because it's not like I'm going to get to fly around in a private jet or do stupid things that billionaires do. We would have to, like, it has to go to the mission. And so would it damage the mission? Would it help the mission? Like, all of those kinds of questions. We can think about more from the perspective of what is good for Wikipedia, what is good for the open movement, what is good for the world. And so in our case, the nonprofit structure is, I think, very, very healthy. Now, my favorite page, there's one that I really like. It's called Inherently Funny Words. Inherently Funny Words. So it's a page someone created once, and for a long time, it became just like this dumping ground where people would just stick silly words in, but there were no sources. And so then it got nominated for deletion. Like, somebody's like, this is stupid. This is just a silly page. It nominated for deletion. And then somebody came in and said, hold on, wait. This is an actual concept in the theory of humor. And a lot of famous comedians and humorists have talked about how certain words are just more funny than others. So if you're writing a joke, in the punchline, if you have certain words, the joke will be funny and other words aren't funny, and that's just interesting. So there's now, it's a good article.
Give us an example. Can you give us an example?
Badger. Okay, maybe it doesn't translate. Words with a Y and a G, like yogurt. Yogurt is a funny word. Badger, anyway. Usually when I do that, badger, people just crack up laughing, and then it's like, there's a proof. So anyway, the page, for a while, it had a fantastic picture, but unfortunately there's no source for it, so it went away. And the picture was of a cow with horns like tied on with a rope, right? So a cow made to look like a bull. And then underneath it had the fantastic caption, according to some, cow is an inherently funny word. I just thought it was brilliant. But there was no source, so it didn't survive. So unfortunately, it doesn't have that illustration now. So that's that. And then, so for Fandom, we haven't talked about tonight. So Fandom is the for-profit that I set up, and it used to be called Wikia, and then we rebranded to Fandom because it turned out that all of the wikis are basically fan sites. A few weren't, and so we've moved those to wikia.org, which is more like the, I don't know, more serious ones and so on. And Fandom is doing incredibly well. We've got hundreds of thousands of wiki communities on sort of deep dives on everything that's like really complicated modern culture. So it's done really well in the era of, like Game of Thrones, House of Cards, sort of mass shows, very deep content where, like for me, when I watch Game of Thrones, I couldn't keep straight. There's like 100 different bearded kings and I don't know their names. And so I had to use the wiki to keep up. So for me, what I love using Fandom for is exactly that. When I'm watching a long form series, and it's pretty good about spoilers. So if this is my complaint. If you read a character's biography, you're probably going to get spoilers. If you read an episode summary, you don't. So oftentimes what I'll do, I think a new series of Stranger Things is coming out soon. I don't know when, but I hope soon. And what I'll do is I'll go back and I'll reread last season's episode so that I can remember what the hell was going on. So that's really good. So it's more like particular wikis of what I'm watching at the moment. That's what I like there, rather than a particular page.
I love it. And I love those articles where they collect the funniest Wikipedia photo captions. And there's that old-timey explorer on the North Pole with the penguin. And then they say, like, sir, whatever, right next to a penguin. But like, it's there to just like somebody just adds like right in brackets. And it's so funny. You crack up. I love that so much. Thank you. We're going to go to Yuri. And then if there is time after that question, then also to Ashley and Harry.
Yeah, thank you, Anna. Thanks everyone for this conversation. My question is really simple, I guess, but we've spoken a lot at great length about what a great project Wikipedia is, and it really is, and obviously I'm a great fan as well. But what I'm curious about is, what do you dislike about it? And if you had to go back in time and start it over, then what, with your experience, what would have you done differently? What do you feel is wrong with Wikipedia, but with all the legacy, it's next to impossible to change now? So you would have liked to change it, but you really can't. And yeah, that's the question. Thank you.
Yeah. So I mean, I always have a trouble with this. One of the things I say about myself is that I'm a pathological optimist. So I always think everything is fine. But part of what I mean by that is when I think back on the past, I have a hard time regretting certain decisions because I know we made them in good faith with all the information we could at the time, and we probably couldn't have done it differently. I mean, we could have got free will, but it's quite hard. And so I oftentimes think of things that I wish were different today, but I understand how we got there, and I don't know how we would have gotten anywhere else. So it's hard, but it's a legitimate question. I mean, I spoke earlier sort of at length about one example, which is that it's become too hard to become an admin. And in fact, I mean, one of the early, I think they quote me still on it. I said being an admin is no big deal. And that was one of our fundamentals in the early days. Because when we first introduced admins, it used to just be me, and I was like the only person who could block anybody or like do some serious things. And that was exhausting, so I couldn't do it. So I'm like, we have to devolve this into the community. But as soon as we started to create admins, there was a real concern about, oh, is this going to become the elite group that runs things in a negative way and so on? So we're just like, no, being an admin is no big deal. It's like, we actually call it the mob. You get the mob. It means you've got some janitorial duties. That's it, right? So we try to not make it an elevated, lofty thing. So those are good. And yet still it's become hard to do. And so the one thing I would say is not so much about, oh, could I have fixed that problem? But it's like, could we have designed some mechanisms that allow us to fix those problems in a more straightforward way? And even that's quite hard, right? So we could say, okay, we can have a method that's different from what we have. Like right now, we don't have any, in order for a change to happen to something big, you have to get to consensus, but there's no clear definition of what consensus means. Does it mean 100% agreement, like not one single person on the site can disagree? No, it can't mean that, because then you could never do anything. Does it mean a majority, 50% plus one? No, that's definitely not consensus. What is consensus, right? What does it mean? And it basically just means if enough people do it, they just make it happen, and then the people who don't like it decide to give up, right? That's not a very good method.
I'm very sorry, just, yeah, I apologize, but just like can't help myself.
Yeah.
You just, we've been talking about how important is it to tell that the moon is not in fact made of cheese.
Yeah.
And we find it easy to tell people who believe that the moon is made of cheese that it's wrong. But now we're saying that it's very difficult to decide on the future of your own project, because 100% consensus is unachievable. So how does it work together?
I think for lots of things, there's, we have certain institutions. We do have like, who is on the arbitration committee? There is a process, right? And it's clearly defined. It's pretty good. Like, I don't have any problems with that process. It works reasonably well. And then we have other areas where even the process of creating a process hasn't worked very well. So the idea of, if we agree that the current process for making admins is lacking in certain ways, then what we are really missing is not a process of making admins, it's a process of making a process to make admins. Like we lack that. If we had that, we could then say, okay, we have to run through this process. So we have a particular type of election or a particular type of vote. And we could do that. I mean, it would probably carry the day. That is the thing, like all of these things, it's all very big. And in fact, I actually think it's one of the differences between the US and the UK and the term constitution. So in the US, people think of the Constitution as a particular written document, right? That is a set of rules. Whereas more generally in political science and in the UK, everybody understands Constitution is a broader set of practices, traditions, conventions, right? Which are there, they're not all written down. And there's a lot of, so for example, the Queen has a lot of theoretical power, which she doesn't actually have. And nobody knows what would happen if she tried to exercise it, right? It's not gonna happen. And similarly, there are conventions like the limitations on the power of the House of Lords. They've got specific things that they, by convention, don't sort of overrule anything that's in the government's manifesto. But what if they did? Like, there is no answer to that question. Like, there just isn't. And that's kind of the way Wikipedia is. Like, there's a set of conventions that have grown up over a long period of time. What if we did something different? Like, there is no, like, everything isn't written down. Like, if you're interested in this kind of thing, a really fun thing to do is read about the game Nomic, N-O-M-I-C, which is almost a thought experiment, but it's a game where you start out with no rules and you go around and you start making up rules. And I don't know exactly how you start, but you sort of start with simple voting is the way you determine the rules. But then quickly people get into things like, somebody will propose a rule like, well, I think from now on, when we vote, I get 2 votes and everyone else gets 1. And then everybody votes against me because that's a bad idea, right? And then so anyway, it's apparently a lot of fun if you're a real like policy process geek. but I think you have to be a real policy process geek. I've never actually played. I've always loved the idea, but we should do a salon.
I love it. We should do a
Maybe.
salon where there are no rules, and then we make up the rules as we go, and then we see how the format would change toward the end. That would be.
I mean, what's interesting is you can't. If you start with no rules, then you basically, I think what happens is you fall back on people's intuitions, which is things like, okay, if it's a majority vote, we'll all agree that that's the rule. So suddenly we just made the first rule.
But I think it's really interesting how I think, you know, at the beginning of this conversation, we spoke about rules and or norms and communities taking norms as if they were rules and everybody keeping to that, everybody, you know, playing a small part in upholding the order or upholding the guaranteeing the peace. But I think what we've seen in for instance, US politics in the past 7 years was that, you know, nobody knows what to do when somebody has the audacity to cross one of these normative lines, right? Like, you know, I was socialized in a world where the democratic values of the US and the UK were, you know, highly respected. And there were certain things that nobody did, even though you theoretically could do that, but nobody did because they just felt that the trade-off would not be worth it, that other people would stop you, or, you know, you would lose your reputation. There would be high social, financial, et cetera, political prices to pay. And then it's like the naughty kids, one tries it and realizes that, you know, actually there's no electricity in the fence and you can climb out, that it was intersubjective reality, and that we need that in order to achieve certain things and to be able to live a certain way, because we think that it's instrumental good. We think that holding to that kind of intersubjective reality will lead to a better objective reality. And so it's worth it. And then somebody says no, because maybe we became cynical or we became disillusioned with certain systems, and that knowledge can be lost, right? There are fantasy novels written about what happens when a generation forgets about, don't put on the ring, dude, you know, don't do it. But then we forget. And so we do need these, you know, arenas of common knowledge like Wikipedia, where we can remember.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting because we're in a very unusual time, I would say, in the US and the UK, and just in the sense of there was this sense that, you know, I grew up in the US, and the whole time you just thought, you know, at the end of the election, you would say, oh, okay, either the person I was for won or the person didn't win, but that's, you know, that's democracy, right? And if I want to change things, then I need to persuade more people before the next election. And now we've got this sort of real, like, well, it's still going on more than it should, denial of the result of the election in a way that's not fact-based, and it's just clearly just trying to prey on people who aren't paying attention and so on. And then here in the UK, and again, there are issues that I think there are reasonable debates to be had about. So, but then there's cases where it's like, yeah, this isn't a reasonable debate. You're just trying to pull something. So they've introduced this concept of requiring photo ID to vote, right? And okay, like, how do you ensure the security of an election? A valid question, to make sure that people are voting who are eligible and that people aren't voting 20 times. And of course, that's a valid area of discussion. But normally it would be accompanied with some real data suggesting that there is a problem. When the opposite view, I'm taking a very particular view on this, the opposite view is there's about 3 million people who mostly vote against the Tories, who don't have the right kind of ID. So do we really believe the Tories are trying to increase the security of election and prevent fraud, or do we just think they're disenfranchising some people? I don't know about you, but I'm kind of skeptical about the reality of that. And, you know, you see that it's being imported from the US, where there's all kinds of aggressive voter suppression legislation under consideration in lots of places. And it's, yeah, and it is, as you say, Anna, it's like, it's the kind of thing where in the past you would hope, and of course there's always, you know, every era, there's no perfect era. There are always politicians who are purely about Machiavellian power grabs. But there's also kind of a sense of honor to say, you know what, I'm not sure if this is going to help my party or not, but it's clearly the right thing for our system of democracy. So I'm going to be for it, even though, I mean, and we've had a few, there's many things that I would disagree with, say, John McCain on, but I always felt like he was willing to kind of do things that weren't in narrow political interest. And we've had lots of politicians on both sides like that. And now it just seems to be really breaking down in a very, I don't know, tough way. So
maybe it's also that being a politician is no longer the coolest job around, right? So maybe it's not the best people who go into politics anymore. There are wonderful exceptions, but maybe overall, people going to tech or other fun arenas of innovation. Thank you so much. Is it okay? Can we do like Ashley and Harry say their questions right next to each other, and then you decide how much you answer?
Sure.
How does that sound? Okay, let's do it very quickly, and then we wrap up. Thank you so much.
Great. Yeah, going back to what you said about paying creators directly, it was a while ago. With the rise of Substack and other media platforms that kind of bypass the middleman, formal editors and publications, how much responsibility is it for the people to kind of hold writers accountable or provide light regulation to preserve the integrity of truth?
Are we going to do both questions first?
Yes, let's go, Harry.
Sure. Yeah, my question is, it's related to something that Tyler Cohen has mentioned, actually, and I know you had a discussion with him at the end of last year. But it's basically, it ties in actually quite nicely with so much stuff that got discussed today, and it's to do with being able to evaluate the quality of sources when you yourself are not very knowledgeable or competent in an area, or perhaps it's a brand new area. So in other words, if you don't already, if you're not able to judge the people who are giving these answers, then you don't know who knows the most or who understands it the best. And sort of paradoxically, if you don't know that answer, it's hard to judge who's the best judge. So in terms of, yeah, that's a question I think probably it's going to be necessary for Wikipedia, but also I just think for people online in general, it's going to be an ever increasing skill, because filtering is the big thing, not the information. So yeah, I just wondered if you had any thoughts on that.
Sure. So these questions are actually somewhat related in a way. So they, with Substack, the rise of Substack, which I think is quite cool and very interesting. What is interesting about it is, that it provides a potentially new and different and interesting business model for journalism, but particularly opinion journalism and so on and so forth. And I think it is complicated and problematic in the sense that normally, let's say something is published in the New York Times or the Guardian or any serious newspaper, we trust the system to greater or lesser extent, but we know there is a system, right? There's an editor-in-chief, and there's editors, and there's people who are looking at things and reviewing and so on and so forth. A lot less fact-checking than I think most people think there is, and so on. Whereas with Substack, it really often it's just like down to the integrity of that one person, which can be phenomenal because there's a lot of great people going on Substack. But it does sort of mean like, I can't just if you just say, oh, I read it on Substack, like I think it's right, I read it on Substack. That feels very different to me from I think it's right, I read it in the New York Times. I mean, I'm not sure because New York Times isn't always right, but that's a credible source, so I sort of believe it. I don't think regulation, I don't really know how to even approach the question of regulation, simply because we do know of places that have regulation where it's only aimed at making sure of quality journalism, places like China, where frankly it's not about quality of journalism, it's really about controlling the political narrative and so on and so forth. And so regulation is always tricky because I wouldn't want sort of Donald Trump or Boris Johnson deciding what's good or not. So anyway, I find regulation very hard to think about as a useful thing. And then Harry, now I've forgotten what you said.
I can recap if you want.
Quickly, yeah.
Yeah, it just basically to do with evaluating the quality of sources when you're passing information.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it becomes very, it's very important. I mean, when you approach an area that you don't know anything about, right? So if I approach an area I don't know anything about, and I try to decide what do I believe in, or what am I going to listen to, and I really think, you know, there's a lot of very classical signifiers that are very useful. So if I read something and it's published in a serious publication from a person who is a scientist at a major institution, right? All of those things increase my trust level over it's somebody ranting on a random blog and I have no idea who they are, and so on. So those are simple and easy. And then we get into more difficult questions like the Substack one, where there's a lot of really great quality people who come from traditional institutions. They haven't become crazy bloggers just because they're on Substack, at least mostly, hopefully not. But, you know, it's hard to know. And then we also face, you know, there's always questions that you have to evaluate, although these days people just call things into question for their own reasons, I think. But, you know, things like, I was just reading something earlier today that I need to dig into more, which is sort of asking the question, did the coronavirus escape from a lab in China or not? Or did it just evolve naturally? I don't think there's really sufficient evidence one way or the other. And anyway, I don't have any, so I don't know the answer to that. But you can imagine like how hard it is to even address that question as a complete amateur, knowing that there's so many incentives around taking a position on that. So maybe some people take a position on it because they're just anti-China. So they want to, it's the China virus, and I'm going to blame China, right? That's not fair. That's obviously not right. On the other hand, would a lab really be defensive about it and want to claim that it didn't happen? Well, of course, they would. They wouldn't want to say, actually, our lab is like super sloppy and dangerous, and we're doing dangerous experiments and it got out, sorry. And then other things like the US sort of was funding some of the research on coronavirus. Fine, that's, you know, funding science, there's nothing wrong with that. But is there any responsibility if, you know, if. So you see, like most of the people who have information that could actually answer the question have an incentive to take a position one way or the other, and that makes it very hard. And so then when you're reading the evidence, it's like, again, like if you see, okay, well, you know, this is publications in serious medical journals, and these are real authorities, and they say it's very unlikely that that happened. And then you've got some crazy person saying the opposite on a crazy blog. That's easy. You just go, well, I don't know. I don't trust crazy people on crazy blogs. But if the CDC and the scientists at MIT and, you know, they're saying one thing, then I tend to believe it. But it's hard. I think there are cases where, well, for one thing, it probably doesn't matter. I mean, my example, like when I get myself interested in that, I'm like, this is a really academic exercise. And absolutely, there's nothing within my range of ability to affect that this is going to change, right? I can't do anything about it either way. So maybe I shouldn't worry too much. Cool.
Thank you so much. Wow, this was a marathon. Thank you for sticking with us and answering all the questions. And thank you guys for all the questions. I mean, I think we've had such a wonderful variety of different topics and different angles coming up. And we really, you know, went around and explored this really complicated topic. So well done, audience, and well done, Jimmy. And so we are going to be wrapping up, and I'm going to stop the recording now. So bear with me 1 second. And thank you for everybody who is watching this on YouTube or Twitter. See you at the next one.